good evening, really. Thank you for coming. I take this invitation very seriously. I think to be the Bollingen lecturer just thrills me to the core of my being. And it's so good that it's in Ohio, because this is the fourth time I've been in Ohio talking about psychological types, or things related to psychological types. This is twice in Columbus now. This is the second time. And there were 2 times in Cleveland. And every single one of the times that I've come to Ohio to talk about Jungian psychology and psychological types, or things that emerge from psychological types, like our discussion tonight, cultural attitudes, it's been what Judy Garland called a pistol. She would say that about when she would give a concert at someplace like Carnegie Hall or Albert Hall in London. If the concert went well, she said, it's a pistol. And I always admired the way she could just stand up there and do it, even though she was singing the same songs. She never sang them quite the same way. And I think that would be true of me as well, although I don't sing. I do have my own repertoire, and I do cover it in different ways, in different places, at different times. But we've got to take very seriously this idea of a Bollingen lecture. Now, I've been to Bollingen once. It was wintertime, and there were things about it that were so different from what I thought. Everyone talks about it as if it were a tower. But it's actually a very squat, rather maternal building that's built around a central kitchen and downstairs room. It's more like a turret than a tower. And I guess I didn't see all of the floors and so forth. But as I sort of nosed around, I got very interested in a particular place that Jung's grandson, Ulrich Herne, who was giving us the tour we got, told me was the place where Jung loved to sit. And it was just an unusually comfortable shelf of rock just outside the building itself, such as it was. And Jung's son, who became an architect, said Bollingen was no architectural masterpiece. Lots of people tried to help Jung, the intuitive type, put it together. And it's a pretty jury-rigged place, but it's charming and nice, but nothing is nicer than that shelf of rock in which Jung could sit. So I tried sitting on it. You can sort of stretch your legs out, and it sort of allows you to sort of be there. And there you're looking out over the Lake of Zurich. And oh my goodness, you have the mountain in the distance, you have the sky, you have the water. You have all you need just to be there in this peaceful place and just take a look at nature and see what nature has to say. And nature always has something to say, as we know. And I just think it was so wonderful that he could arrange his life in such a way that he could take pretty much 4 months out of every year and go to that place and just notice nature until finally he was satisfied that he was in touch with some kind of movement, and then come up with something relatively natural in the description of that hardest of all things to understand, which is our own psychology, our own personality. And the topic he particularly took on is how this biological entity that we are, with our everything from our brain to our toes, with all that tough stuff in the middle from the heart and below, is able somehow to evince consciousness and make its own healthy connection to nature, rather than the obvious one that we see more often all the time, the unhealthy one. So that became, he must have watched the way the birds moved and the fish moved and even the way the mountain and the clouds moved, and he somehow figured out how we move. Now, he called Bollingen, when he got to, he actually wrote it somewhere, called it the retreat of Philemon and the repentance of Faust. If you've had a chance to look at Jung's Red Book or read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, or pay attention to biographies of Jung, and you know something about when he wrote the Red Book, why he wrote the Red Book, when he was associated with Freud, when he broke with Freud, when he did various things he did, those words make utter sense. So I want to give them a typological reading tonight, and I want to give them a reading in terms of the development of Jung's cultural attitude toward the writing of psychology itself. Now, let's talk about the repentance of Faust first. Jung was a medical doctor, and the word doctor comes from a Latin word. It essentially means knower, Knower. In other words, the expert. And as someone who's gone through much of the same kind of training Jung went through in medicine and psychiatry, I can tell you there's no power trip like a medical power trip. I don't know anyone who's gone through medical school who hasn't had a dream that they've sacrificed some very vital part of themselves. And I think one's soul can go on the chopping block very early in that process of wanting to be the authority on absolutely everything. And some of us come to the point where we repent that Faustian bargain that we have to make to do all the things we have to do to establish ourselves as authorities and somehow submit to the amazing discipline of healing. Now, I'm not going to criticize medicine very long in a state like Ohio that has the Cleveland Clinic. I think you're a fantastic state for good doctoring, and I think American medicine is a fantastic achievement. But there has been, and in my lifetime, a lot of learning about things that we weren't taught when I was in medical school. And some of the things that we know now about how one works with patients are very different from the way I was taught. And so in Jung's time, it was even worse. To be Herr Doctor in a Swiss-German university was really to be somebody. And it played into the ambitions of very young men. And so when Jung made his visit to see Freud for the first time in Vienna, and Freud saw this psychiatrist joining Freud in that band of people, very few of whom were even medically trained like himself, but many of whom didn't have the psychiatric background. And Jung had already more psychiatric reputation than Freud did when they met, because he was the bright young man in psychiatry at that time and had actually figured out a way to deal with the psychology of what was then called dementia praecox. Freud was thrilled, and Jung was thrilled to be accepted, and so the Faustian bargain was struck. They were going to create this very powerful new psychology, this new depth psychology, and it was going to compete with others that were around. And so for a while there, Jung was working more and more around the world like a general for the budding psychoanalytic movement. And so it's not a surprise that when things got tense between them, Jung had this dream that he had to kill Siegfried, because Siegfried was the son of Sigmund, and Sigmund Freud had already told Jung playfully that he was making him his crown prince. Well, the crown prince of Sigmund in the Germanic myth was Siegfried, and Jung sort of tried to live up to the role by battling literally everybody who disagreed with Freud, including the very famous, most famous psychotherapist in Europe at the time, Pierre Janet, who Jung had studied with as a young man in 1902 when he went to Paris. And at that time, Janet was the most famous psychotherapist in Europe. He had a theory of the subconscious 10 years before Freud began to talk about the unconscious. And he was someone who dealt with all kinds of things that were basic to depth psychology. And there was Jung on the hustings saying things like, well, why should we listen to someone from France who can't even read German, and statements like that. I mean, the Jung of that time was really not somebody that you would have wanted to know. And there was a real ruthless battling between these people at that time. And so Jung realized that Freud was absolutely thrilled with the creativity of creating a psychoanalytic theory. But he also saw that there were certain limitations to Freud's thinking. Later on, Jung was able to say, and I think with some accuracy about Freud, that he felt that Freud was essentially an introverted feeling type. But for some reason, Freud had turned from feeling to try to develop an ambition, an extroverted thinking theory of the soul. And Freud was very rigid in the way he developed that theory, and it was almost religious for him that people do it just the way Freud had wanted to do it. So around 1912, Jung gives a wonderful series of lectures at Fordham University, in which called The Theory of Psychoanalysis, in which in the most intelligent and thoughtful way, he rethinks Freudian theory, and it becomes an informed critic and a willingness to try to extend it with a kind of different kind of extroverted thinking that could perhaps make it more truly useful. In fact, what he came up with is something very much like the relational psychoanalysis of today that Freudians of today's vintage take so seriously. But at the time, it felt to Freud like a betrayal, and Freud would have none of it. And Jung became increasingly furious at Freud's inability to accept the help that he had turned to Jung to get. Instead, Jung was more and more becoming the person who was ruining psychoanalytic theory, and all kinds of sparks flew between them. So in the midst of that came the dream of his having to kill Siegfried. That was a very important dream that he had on the year's anniversary of the last personal letter he sent to Freud, which Freud absolutely rejected. So it was a kind of anniversary dream in which Jung had to kind of finally kill Siegfried, but an unbearable feeling of guilt remained. That's in the dream. You may have read that in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He has to kill Siegfried with the help of a brown-skinned man. It's an assassination, but an unbearable feeling of guilt remains. Now, of course, a Freudian interpretation of that would be that Jung felt guilty at breaking with Freud. I don't think so. I think that the Siegfried was not Freud. It was not an encoding of Sigmund Freud. nor was it only the literal break with Freud as Freud's crown prince, but what many of us have had to do, that's such a painful thing when we have to do it, it was Jung's breaking of his identification with Freud and that whole way of going about making psychology as if you're fighting a war. All those warring schools. And you know, as Jung was going through the psychoanalytic battles, World War I was coming where there would actually be a war between Germany and France. And there was some part of Jung which was beginning to realize that solutions to psychological problems, which leave a lot of blood on the floor, are not actually good even for psychology, but they're terrible for the world. If the world's soul is suffering, it doesn't need a lot of titans teaching psychology, having their wars with each other. So Jung becomes very aware and has the fantasies that you know about of that he had on the train where he was going to Sunday dinner with his mother-in-law, where suddenly he sees Europe covered by a lake of blood. And this, of course, is just a few days after the last time he saw Freud, and it's the fall of 1913, and and the Siegfried dream comes right after that, the killing of Siegfried. And in December, we know exactly when it was, and it's to the day of the date, a year before, of that letter that he sends to Freud, which causes Freud to say to him, I don't want to have any more personal letters from you. So you get all of this energy around saying goodbye to the hero, saying goodbye to heroic battle, saying goodbye to the male knower. But he goes and looking for the soul he'd lost, because when he went to see Pierre Janet in 1902, he stopped writing in a journal he had kept since his late teens, before he got into university and the decision to be a psychiatrist and medical school in the early days of working with Bleuler and the great psychiatrist in Central Europe. And all this time, Jung had kept a spiritual diary and kept track of his own soul. But when he goes to Paris and takes off and wants to be this great medical player on the international scene, something he had achieved perfectly already by 1907, 5 years later, Jung stops writing in that book. He stops writing in his spiritual diary altogether. And when he sees the images of the lake of blood all over Europe, and he wonders as a psychiatrist, my God, am I having one of those world catastrophe fantasies that often precedes a psychotic break? Dementia precox patients, now called schizophrenia patients by his chief Bleuler, that's how schizophrenia often starts. Someone has a fantasy that the world is coming to an end, there's a terrible earthquake, there's devastation, something. So Jung is really scared that that he's doing a schizophrenia. So he said, my God, I have really lost touch with my own psyche. I've lost touch with my soul. And so for dear life, he says, I've got to get my soul back. So being someone who never, good Swiss, who never threw away a book, kept a card catalog on every single book he read from the age of 15 on, so that you could have an index card of kept track of his mind. He had that black book there that he was using to write down his soul experiences and where it stopped in 1902. And in 1913, 11 years later, he started up again. So his going on a journey to find his soul was him writing down his spiritual experiences again. Except at this time, he developed a new method. And the new method was this method of fantasy that he calls active imagination, which was an attempt to stop theorizing about the psyche and have an actual experience, a phenomenological experience of what is actually there. What does the psyche consist of? who is it? What does it belong to? How is it? And he goes inside on a search for his soul. And he practically meets her at the door. I mean, the fantasies turn out to be in Technicolor and stereophonic sound. There's this wonderful rock wall, and there's Elijah, and next to him is Salome, and Elijah points to Salome and says, here's your soul. Except that, my stars, his soul was Salome. Salome, the heroine of Oscar Wilde's play that was so outrageous that it couldn't be performed in England and had to be written in French and performed in France, which is all about Salome asking for the head of John the Baptist from Herod. The scene is wonderful, absolutely wonderful in the Wilde play, because Salome is being pimped by her daughter as the daughter of Herodias, who is the wife then of Herod, that same Herod who caused the massacre of the innocents, and for Jesus to be taken by Mary and Joseph for safety to Egypt. That same Herod had heard John the Baptist preaching and saying there's a new king coming, and that sounded very heretical, so they put him in jail, and there was this man in jail. And then Herodias wants more and more power, so she has this very attractive belly dancer's daughter, Salome, and Salome does the Dance of the Seven Veils for her stepfather, and it's a little bit like someone auditioning for Louis B. Mayer in the 1930s in MGM. Louis B. Mayer is said to have said to Jean Harlow, Jean, have you got anything for me? And this one is a little bit turned around. All Herod said to Salome is, well, you're quite a dancer. What can I do for you? And Salome immediately said, bring me the head of John the Baptist. And why was that? Because Salome had seen John coming into her stepfather's castle, carried by the guards, and said, oh, John, give me a kiss. And being a holy men all over the world at different times have been forbidden to touch women, John the Baptist was not going to give Salome a kiss. So now Salome has her revenge. Bring me the head of John the Baptist. And in Oscar Wilde's play, the head is presented on a silver platter, still dripping blood. They've chopped it off and brought it in. And Salome lifts the head off, says in French, as she kisses it, J'ai baisé ta bouche, Yochanan. I have kissed your lips, John. Now, one reason psychology should not be written by people using thinking in an unrelated, theoretical, power-driven way is that even as late as 1925, when he was doing his English seminar and talking about his book, Psychological Types, which was then published, and talking about some of his Red Book experiences, and brought this up. Jung wants to tell us that Salome was his anima, and he was an introverted thinking type, because he was an introvert, and he had thinking, so that meant he was an introverted thinking type, says Jung. And since introverted thinking types have anima figures who are extroverted and feeling, Salome has to be an extroverted feeling type. Tell me that bring me the head of John the Baptist, and lifting the head off the belly dance, the whole thing is extroverted feeling. And I'll have to send you to one of my lieutenants for an education in psychological type. I don't think anybody in this room would say that. And you have to remember that Jung started psychological types in a very theoretical way. He only had two types at the beginning, introvert and extrovert. And all the introverts were thinking types, and all the extroverts were feeling types. So even as late as 1925, he was falling back in a lazy way on that introverted thinking, extroverted feeling model. And there you have the problem. There you have the problem of the theory running the man, running the psychology rather than the experience. So that although Jung had certainly opened the door to letting the psyche speak to him rather than him tell the psyche what it is, he had nowhere nearly finished that task by 1925. And it's around that time that he's really going to Bollingen in earnest. So what's happening at Bollingen, and how does it represent a different way of doing psychology than from the head and from the theory, the very thing he had objected to so much in Freud, and the need to sort of make yourself great by having as airtight as possible a theory and not somehow speaking to the actual soul experience at all. Well, if you read the Red Book thoroughly, and you spend a lot of time looking at how the figure of Philemon comes up as a fantasy figure that Jung finds, you'll find that Philemon is able to do something Jung himself could not do, but like so many medical men who want to be intellectuals wished he could do. That Philemon can do what Jung himself called, when he was at his very best in laying out really 8 functions, or as we call them today, 8 function attitudes, rather than just 2. Philemon was able to do something the young Jung and Freud always was able to do for the most part. Philemon could use introverted thinking and actually think in an original, fresh way, defining clearly the phenomenon at hand by doing it freshly rather than developing a set of terms that would never change their meaning over time and would be taught again and again in the same way over and over again. Now, it was Philemon and his ability to contact him that drew Jung back to Bollingen over and over again, because when he introverted enough, Jung could actually go down into himself and think from the core of his being and really be in touch with what actually felt true to him at the deepest level, rather than what played well on the marketplace of theories that medical psychology usually was. And so Philemon already gives a first sketch of the discipline we now call analytical psychology, or simply Jungian psychology, when he gives a talk to the dead who've come back from, the dead Anabaptists have come back to visit Jung, saying they've gone out to all the holy places and have not found what they were seeking. And there was some synchronicity, because for some reason the doorbells started ringing in the Jung household, and even one of the children saw a ghost. So it looked to everybody as if the spirits had actually come and visited the house. But after Philemon gave this talk, the 7 sermons to the dead, they never bothered anybody again. So apparently Philemon came up with what they had not found at all the holy places. And I think that what Philemon was doing was creating a psychology that would really satisfy the seekers from a soul vantage point, rather than just theories that would satisfy other doctors. And I think that you could, the Anabaptists that are in the Red Book, Jung actually calls them those crazy Anabaptists. They were an interesting group of people at the time. And they may have been a bit much, but they knew when they were hearing something that didn't offend the spirit, and they weren't going to let go until they did. And so Jung came up with a psychology that many of us have found enormously nourishing, because it stays awfully close when it's at its best to what we actually experience. And we can forgive him the moments when he, like everybody else, is dogmatic about this and that, because so often he gets it right, and particularly the way he lets the dream and the actual experience of people take the lead rather than his theory take the lead. He doesn't tell the unconscious what it is. He lets the unconscious speak to us, and we still get nourished by that. So that was an amazing achievement for this man, who was probably never, ever, ever an introverted thinking type, much as he wanted to be. He was almost certainly an introverted intuitive type. And that anima figure that he met, Salome, who was so physical with her belly dance and her wish for a physical kiss, and holding up for the woman's body, and for the eagerness to have that recognized, and lifting the head off and pressing it to her lips, and that being her triumph. Surely isn't that extroverted sensation, just what you would expect from the type theory, introverted intuitive man with extroverted sensation, anima. So what about Jung's thinking? Well, wasn't his thinking an auxiliary extroverted thinking that he tried to use as Siegfried to help Sigmund, who was using anima extroverted thinking and the creative surge and the wish for loyalty? He had his psychoanalytic colleagues in Vienna swear fealty to the sexual theory of psychoanalysis as if they were medieval knights serving a lady, and he gave them all a ring that they had to wear to say that they would never abandon the sexual theory. That's anima behavior, folks. That's a seductive and demanding anima that love in a man who, by that point, had stopped having sex with his own wife, may or may not have been having a bit of an affair with her sister, but was basically, the love of his life was his own theory. And Jung was trying, with his extroverted thinking, to straighten that out and be a good, loyal son. And he was serving an ambition, a very wonderful, creative ambition. Sigmund Freud was not someone to be dismissed. He was a very important figure in Jung's life and in the life of our culture. But this extroverted thinking inflation that is sort of the payoff over and over again in Western culture. We get so carried away with extroverted thinking, and the latest version of that is going to be voted on soon. And it's really quite a dreadful thing, the way we've repeatedly been captured by ideas that have to be a certain way. It's a big problem for Western culture, and not just for America, and not just for Switzerland or Vienna or wherever. It's all over the place, and it's very patriarchal. The patriarchal anima very much goes in for that, and you can see why Salome wanted some man's head off. I mean, you really can understand it. I'm not going to forgive it, but I can understand it, at least, why it could happen that way. In any case, Jung discovered that he had to accept her as his anima, and he'd already made up his mind that he was going to get his soul back, whoever she was, and that's who it was. And so out of that came a kind of embodied realism to Jung, which I think makes his psychology very, very exciting. So notice how the categories Jung himself gave us in the book Psychological Types, and I've named quite a few of them. I named introverted feeling for Jung's Freud's dominant function. I named introverted intuition for Jung's dominant function. I named extroverted thinking for Freud's anima. I named extroverted sensation for Jung's anima figure, and I named this extroverted thinking as a well-meaning fatherliness toward Freud that was taking place in the case of being Siegfried, the loyal son to the father. But then I brought in a new figure, Philemon, who was Jung's wise old man, a wise and intelligent Cynex who would have introverted thinking. So you begin to see how different parts of a person, different figures in a person, and dynamics between people, and dynamics between parts of ourselves are all governed by these 8 function attitudes of consciousness that Jung describes so brilliantly in chapter 10 of Psychological Types, so brilliantly that even he, throughout his lifetime, could not fully realize the possibilities of what he had discovered simply by looking, as he did at Bollingen, at what was there rather than thinking with his mind about what should be there. So Jungian psychology is an amazing ability to look at different sorts of consciousness that are constantly creating different kinds of patterns and skeins and interactions in us. And so what I'm going to talk about today, in talking about cultural attitudes and talking about the cultural attitude Jung brought to depth psychological theorizing, is how often we have to make a stretch beyond what is simply comfortable to ourselves to be able to meet some cultural challenge that just being who we are and making that okay is not enough for. Now this flies right in the face of what we've always counted on Jungian psychology to do, to give us kind of licenses to be ourselves. For a long, long time, as I was learning the 8-function model and learning about psychological types, I thought that the great thing about Jungian psychology was its ability to create for each of us a kind of spine of personality that would protect and maintain the spinal cord of our very connection to the unconscious. And that seemed to me so healthy and so good that I almost saw what I was doing as a kind of chiropractic of the soul, in the sense that I was trying to figure out what it would be like for the different 8 starting points that I've carefully mapped out for you in the handout that you have in green. That's sort of like the sensation key to this all. This is what we see. 8 function attitudes, each a different starting point. And I started with, in the map, with SE, which means extroverted sensation. And below it, I put its introverted opposite, introverted sensation. And below that, intuition, extroverted. And then intuition, introverted. And then thinking, extroverted. And then thinking, introverted. Then feeling, extroverted. And then feeling, introverted. Those are the 8 function attitudes, and they are what Jung called the psychological types. These are not types of people. They're types of consciousness. And they're the starting point for anybody's journey. And I felt that it was really important for each and every one of us, if we can, to find our inner opposite, often, but not always, a figure opposite in every respect, including gender, so that as with Jung, the introverted intuitive finds Salome, the extroverted sensation type. Or perhaps I should say it the other way around, because this is the way it so often happens in therapy and in middle life. Jung, thinking he was a thinking type, found an extroverted sensation anima who taught him that he was an introverted intuitive type. That's what really happens in the Red Book. She gives him the gifts of magic, the gifts of prophecy. She gets him to trust his intuition. When he met Salome in his active imagination, Jung did not know he was an intuitive type. He didn't even have the category intuitive type. That category was offered to him by a real-life woman, Maria Molzer, who gave a talk in 1916 and said there should be a third function to thinking and feeling. And that was introverted intuitive. The intuitive function, she said, not introverted, but the intuitive function. And Jung later realized there needed also to be a sensation function, and so by the time he wrote Psychological Types, he had 4 functions, and he had 2 attitudes, and so you got 8 function attitudes. Thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, all in extroverted and introverted aspects, creating 8 very different kinds of personality, consciousness, approach to life, spiritual energy, ambitions, and I've tried to lay out what these 8 function attitudes imagine they're doing, what they're like when we meet them at the personal level or evince them and show to other people, what they're like at the ego level, and what they're like at the self level. Now, you've been watching me give this lecture now for a while, and so I'm going to tell you that I always start with my persona by being as entertaining as possible. I'm trying to entertain you as I get you to entertain my ideas. That's how I start. That's how all extroverted intuitives start. And then, what am I trying to do at the ego level? I'm trying to envision for you. I'm envisioning how we could open up typology and make it something we can actually see and use in a more interesting way than we've done so far, with so many systems that have used it, including, unfortunately, the MBTI, good as it can be. Now, the third thing is, but why am I doing all that? Where's myself in all this? And where is my real ultimate reason for being here and doing this for such a long time? It's because I really want to enable people to begin to use the consciousness they have, because we need it so badly. It's badly needed, have you noticed? So therefore, it seems to me I've got to let psychology, at least typology, be something that enables people to do something. So that something is more than realizing the inner opposite, I have concluded, that enables us to get an axis of selfhood that the great Edward Edinger in his book Ego and Archetype calls the ego-self axis. That spine of personality is defined by the dominant function and the inferior function, and it is a glory when you achieve that. And there are chapters in my book in which I describe how that worked for me and how it's worked for people in my practice and how important it is. So yes, it is important to know that if you start with extroverted feeling, you're likely to find a soul figure that's introverted thinking. If you start with extroverted thinking, you'll find a soul figure that's introverted feeling. And if you start with, I'm sort of getting lost in my own meta, but my point is you get 8 kinds of spines, and if I had a blackboard, I would draw them. But if I'm going to name them, just for the extroverted sensation type, the introverted intuitive type is the soul figure. For the introverted sensation type, the extroverted intuitive is the soul figure. For the extroverted intuitive type, the introverted sensation is the soul figure. For an introverted intuitive like Jung, extroverted sensation is the soul figure. For someone like Freud, going to the bottom, introverted feeling, his soul figure would be extroverted thinking. For someone with extroverted feeling, the soul figure is introverted thinking. For someone with introverted thinking, the soul figure is extroverted feeling. And for someone who has extroverted thinking, the soul figure is introverted feeling. Now, I spent 30 years checking this out to see if it was true before I let myself publish that book. And I will tell you that I verified it to the best I know how. I've seen it in hundreds and hundreds of dreams of patients. I've thought about it in historical figures, everyone. And these terms have a lot of meaning for me. I don't expect you in the audience to all have the same meaning. But I do think you can get the idea that thinking and feeling are opposites. The sensation and intuition are opposites. And I think you can get the idea that an introverted something has an extroverted something as its opposite. And in that way, you get 8 spines of personality. And therefore, we can accept that there are 8 basic core selves, and that if we sorted out the people in the room, as I've done in other places, and people who have one kind of spine sit at one table, and people with another kind of spine sit at another table, we could come together, and people could do reports from each table. 2 or 3 of you would surely have introverted intuitive top and extroverted sensation below. Some of you would be like me, extroverted intuition top, introverted sensation. And then there's so many rational types around. You're going to have the introverted feelers will have extroverted thinking, and the extroverted thinkers will have introverted feelings. So gradually the spines could collect, and we could have 8 tables here. And each of you would belong at one of those 8 tables. And each of you would feel in some way very seen and very held to have what is integrity for you respected. Shouldn't that be enough? Sadly, no. Because a cultural attitude is not the same as a narcissistic mirror on the wall telling you that you're the fairest of them all. Narcissism has not helped our society, even when it's supported by emotional intelligence. I mean, that's one of the failure of simply finding oneself, following one's bliss, as Joseph Campbell called it. And I loved Joseph Campbell, and I knew him very well, but it's not enough. It's not enough only to be yourself, because we have to live in a world where we encounter others. We're practically in a cold civil war in this country because self does not know how to relate to other. And I think that shows a failure of psychology to do its work. So James Hillman once said, we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world isn't getting any better. So I'm saying back, just give me 100 years. And that's what I'm going to try to give you the basis for the next 100 years. So the basis for the next 100 years requires that though we don't want to, we have to stretch ourselves beyond what is comfortable for us. So that stretch beyond what we can control, what we can handle, what we can manage, that's what cultural attitudes are. Now, somewhere in this little book, I tucked away something I'd love to talk to you from or about. And I'll bet you anything I put it in the other folder, because I said to myself, where will you put this? You'll put it in the other folder. But no, that's how I break the spell. It's here. Now, some of you have seen or used the tarot deck. And I want you to pass this around and then get them back to me. These were given to me by an amazing man who studies the tarot. You can find him online. His name is Michael Howard. I was lucky enough to be on his dissertation committee when he got his PhD at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and no one has written about the imagery in the tarot deck more brilliantly than Michael Howard, and the things he's writing are amazing. And he went to a lecture I had in which I was talking, and I'll be showing the film I was talking about tomorrow at the workshop. There's a moment in the film, one of the films I show, where the character's mother asks the character if he ever has prayed. And he said, yes, I pray. They're both Catholic in the story. I won't tell you the film name at the moment. Perhaps you'll recognize it, perhaps not. And the mother says, what have you prayed for? He said, I've prayed for help. And she says, pray for strength. Pray for strength. So Michael heard me talk about how moving I found that, and he thought that I didn't understand strength at all, because strength is actually a character in the tarot deck that he studied so often. It's the card known as Fortitude, representing the, or force. It's La Fortezza in Italian, I guess. It's one of the cardinal virtues of Plato, the other being justice, temperance, and prudence. And the idea of the strength that it takes to endure and hold on to a faith in God in the face of the obvious fact that despite God's existence, evil continues to exist in the world, the greatest problem that people have had to face and that many, many people have faced. And it's the reason that Jung names Mani, the great founder of Manichaeism, as one of the four pillars of the spirit that he drew upon, the others being Moses, the Buddha, and Jesus. But he lists Mani, who actually felt that evil was a living problem. And what the Manichaeans, who were a form of Christian, draw also on Judaism and Zoroastrianism, were working toward, and what became really the first world religion, because it went all the way to China, and there were still Chinese practicing Manichaeism as late as the 19th century. The awareness of the enormous problem, even for those who are very clear about what they believe, is this enormous problem presented to all of us by the fact of the other and the otherness of evil in the face of the goodness we can get from our own connection to the soul and to the unconscious and to our own wisdom. There's still the problem of the evil out there. And so, and also, of course, our own tendency to go along with that. So this card that Michael Howard sent to me in various forms, and I'm just showing you a couple of them, shows a woman holding open the jaws of a lion. Now, this woman there's been so much discussion of this, and this has been compared to some degree with Samson and many other things, Androcles and the lion. They even have talked about it with Hercules. But the interesting thing is the woman holding open the jaws of the lion. And people have thought, well, perhaps it's because she's trying to put a poison in to kill the lion, as somebody said one of the Christian martyrs was able to do. But what I want to offer you is the idea that the beauty is taking the beast and stretching it. Now, that stretch is what I think requires a certain kind of fortitude, where you go beyond your own comfort zone of consciousness and what is virtue for you, and what is the virtue of you, and what is your standpoint in being able to connect with virtue, and you actually see what it would be like to stretch. Now that's what I think Jung did when he found Philemon, when he stretched beyond the young man's wish. Well, there was the young man's fantasy of being an introverted thinking type, which he had to face was not true, but maybe he could find with his introverted intuition and his wonderful auxiliary extroverted thinking, Jung and INTJ by MBTI terminology, may have been able, he would have thought, to do a better job than Freud at writing a theory. And then he discovers that the very act to be so sure of your ground when you're talking about the psyche is part of the problem. And so he goes inside and increases something. What is that something he increases? He goes from extroverted thinking to introverted thinking, which is an enormous stretch, particularly when there's a very idealistic boy in him who is the introverted feeling type that got the religious crush on Freud and was willing finally to become the son. So in the way, the son is using his extroverted thinking to help the father, but the introverted feeling wants to find a psychology that really feels good and is very snobby and ruthless about it. And what he finds he needs is to go all the way from introverted feeling to introverted thinking, to construct an attitude that's adequate to writing psychology. And I gotta tell you how hard that is. It's very, very hard to stretch beyond yourself in that way. Have you ever, as a psychotherapist, had someone who has dominant introverted feeling and tried to use introverted thinking in talking to them? It's quite an unpleasant experience, I have to tell you. And have you ever had an introverted thinking type in your life and you've tried to explain introverted feeling to them in the simplest way? It just is, we all know, there's such a thing as being not 6 degrees of separation, but 7 degrees of separation from another person. And we all, sooner or later, have that other person close in somewhere in our lives. It's like life itself is constantly asking us to make this stretch. Well, I think Jung made that stretch. And what he constructed for psychology, and it's still not recognized enough, is what I would call an adequate philosophic attitude. And by a philosophic attitude, I don't mean just the ability to philosophize. Jung was really not interested in becoming, for instance, a theosophist. He wasn't interested in that. There are analogies to Rudolf Steiner, there are analogies to Swedenborg, but he didn't want to be there. He actually had the ambition of doing something with psychology that was close in some ways to Immanuel Kant, and at the same time, he wanted to be able to understand the kind of introverted feeling that when it isn't respected makes people psychologically ill. He was a therapeutic psychiatrist who actually developed a way of talking about psychology that makes the introverted feeling and the introverted thinking come together. And he's given many of us a philosophic attitude toward reading psychology and reading psychological theory. And following that path, I have to say, is quite something. And I feel that that ability to generate that kind of philosophical attitude toward psychology makes him a philosopher of psychology and a psychologist of philosophy. It's really quite something. Philosophy is not just a set of good ideas. It's also a set of good ideas that have been tested for their value. If you really read a really great philosopher like Wittgenstein, part of the wonderful thing about Wittgenstein is not just his introverted thinking, which is sublime, but also the degree of introverted feeling he joins to it to try to question the value of an idea. It's a very strong thing. Well, anyway, Jung got as close to that as I think any psychologist has been able to do. It's not the general view of him, but that he did. And there I think he really achieved something for his writing by discovering Philemon. So, Faust was at an end, selling your soul to just give yourself over to the extroverted thinking project of another man and of yourself and medical ambition. That's the repentance. That has to be repented at Bollingen. The stretch that takes place is to go to introverted thinking and to make sure that it checks out with an introverted feeling sense of what psychology needs. So let's look for a minute to understand how I'm thinking here. Let's look at introverted feeling as a function that involves initially judging, appraising, and finally establishing the value. And so when a Jungian looks at a psychological idea, a Jungian will judge it, appraise it, and establish its value. And if it's really a value for the psyche, they hold on to it. If it's not a value, they don't hold on to it. They won't accept it. And that's what I've loved about being a Jungian. At the same time, and this is where I think Jungians have sometimes not done the job they could have done, and I step in thinking that I can help, is that I think things need to be named properly. They need to be defined clearly and freshly, and that should lead to greater understanding. When you can get the kind of understanding that you can establish the value of, and you can, at the same time, value understanding, then you can get to this amazing thing that Jung was able to get to at times at Bollingen, when in retreat, Philemon could speak to him, and not as a knower, but as a learner from his own unconscious, his introverted feeling, which was priggish and difficult and judgmental. It comes up repeatedly in the Red Book as a kind of inflated sort of thing that needs to learn a lot. That part of him yielded to a larger philosophy of a psychology for humanity. So all of that was how Jung developed he developed his rational side in a very extraordinary way by stretching it beyond the limitations of just any other German intellectual. Now, I'd like to shift ground completely and show you something much more fun, much less dire, and just as real a problem for all of us. But first, you need a stretch. You have to step in your chair. You have to sort of stay around because I've got some stuff to show you before we break, and I need to show you a film clip. So I can't let you have refreshments and so forth. We'll be here till 10 o'clock, or you'll leave and you won't get the good part. But just move around. Remind yourself you have bodies. Live, breathe. Forget what I've just said.
This is the end of CD number 1. The lecture continues on CD number 2.
Okay, so I'm going to have you go back to your seats now. So, Jung, as I said, discovered that something needs to be done about psychology if it's ever going to operate as a philosophy of life. And he did something about that in what he came up with. And I think that's what's so wonderful about Jungian psychology, and it can still get better. A philosophical attitude that's appropriate to psychology was a necessity in Jung's time, and it was the development of a cultural attitude in the modern period, and it was a philosophical attitude for the modern period that could be compared to the philosophical attitude that had informed the ancient world, and for a while the medieval world, and then seemed to get into all kinds of problems in the period from Descartes on, where no one quite knew how to bring thinking and feeling together. And Jung finds an interesting way to do it for psychology. Now, let's take a cultural attitude problem that every single one of you have experienced. Is there anyone here who's never gone on vacation ever in their life? No. Have you noticed that when you go on vacation, it's really hard to have a good time? Have you noticed that you're almost never comfortable, that you don't like where you came to, you don't like the hotel, you don't like the place, you don't like the people, you can't... Sometimes first 2 or 3 days out of a vacation, I have to just sulk in my hotel room before I'm willing to go out there. Getting the right attitude toward vacationing is actually one of the most difficult human problems, probably second only to buying the right kind of house, only to housing. We don't talk enough about those problems. But going on vacation is tough. And so we all try to go somewhere where something beautiful will either show itself to us or just will happen. Something beautiful. We go for a kind of aesthetic relief. We're looking for an aesthetic experience. We're constantly... At the airport, I could buy 22 places National Geographic tells me I ought to go, and I look at them all and I say, the trouble with that is I'm going to go and I'm not going to find it beautiful. It's just not going to work for me. So when I think I'm thinking now about where I'm going to spend my 80th birthday next year, and I'm not sure. It's very hard. It's just always hard. It's always hard. So every so often, there's a film about someone going on a vacation. And I've always liked the way the movies depict problems that I don't understand in any other way. And by far the greatest is a French film that was released in 1953 that some of you may know as Mr. Hulot's Holiday, Les Vacances de Monsieur Hulot, by one of the greatest comedians ever to grace the cinema, and by far the greatest, I think, in the sound era, just as Chaplin and Keaton are so great in the silent era. In the sound era, I think no one has come closer to being amazing than Jacques Tati, who, like Chaplin, not only directed his films, but also often starred in them with his amazing character, Mr. Hulot. So imagine yourself, as he asks you to do, somewhere in Brittany, and I guess near enough to England that you're in a French hotel, partially filled with English tourists, and everybody's a wet blanket in a different way. And the only person who's absolutely essential to everything is Mr. Hulot, who in some ways is very like me. He's an extroverted, intuitive type. And Mr. Hulot is constantly trying to entertain another possibility, and he's coming up blank. He keeps trying to make this vacation come alive, not only for himself, but for the others that are in this hotel. And it's getting more and more drab, and the time is running out when a lot of people are going to be leaving. So, as extroverted intuitives do, he goes wandering off, looking for something more interesting, stirring around for something more lively. And that's where our film clip begins, with one of the English tourists saying, "Where is Mr. Hulot?" He's disappeared. And we're going to watch the problem faced by the people in the house, and we're going to see what Mr. Hulot is doing behind the scenes to offer something that has been left out, and you can see for yourself whether or not he succeeds in making one of those impossible vacations that you wish you hadn't taken the best time you ever had. Okay, I've written about this in my book, and believe me, this is a very hard scene to write up. So I am not going to try to do this ad lib. I'm going to give it to you as I wrote it. My argument is that one of the things that makes something like a vacation possible is the aesthetic attitude is constructed, hopefully, in a group of people, so that suddenly the whole thing, the beauty of the whole thing comes across. Now, there's a tendency, even in Jung, to speak of the aesthetic attitude, and we come back to the figure of Salome, as simply a matter of extroverted sensation, so that we sometimes think that the more lush and beautiful the colors are, the more sensory stimulation of the right kind, such as the marvelous food we can have now if we pay enough money, that kind of thing, that's somehow what is going to please and satisfy. But having gone to a lot of expensive dinners in San Francisco and left not only poorer in bank account, but also poorer in spirit than I arrived, I've learned, as I think most of you have, that extroverted sensation by itself is kind of an orphan. Even though it seems to be so lush and splendid and has so much texture, and what it wants to do seems to require that other thing, which is some kind of extroverted intuition joining it, that allows it to go somewhere unexpected. And it's that thing, it seems to me, that's so sadly lacking in this group of people. I guess the forms of a vacation are all there. The Brittany Coast is beautiful. The jazz record is on the Victrola, and the little boy, who seems to me to be an extroverted sensation type, the way he moves the chair around, is looking to move his feet and start moving his body. What he's trying to achieve maybe could happen, but they're not ready for that. They're not really, the extroverted sensation isn't really working for them. And Mr. Hulot's gone off somewhere. Well, where Mr. Hulot's gone off is to try to solve this problem for the culture in an intuitive way. Now, remember, an extroverted intuitive, you may have watched me flounder around. Mr. Hulot is a marvelous example. The inferior function is introverted sensation. So seeing him try to fill the water can so that he can put out the fireworks on the turning around, if that doesn't, I believe I've done things like that. People have watched me do things like that. So let's, with that bit of typological realization, that Mr. Hulot, and also Jacques Tati, the director, is willing to make the stretch I was talking about and go beyond extroverted intuition or just introverted sensation, which he's so clumsy at, but so courageous at keeping at. He has to make the stretch over, or achieve for that group of people, a stretch into extroverted sensation so that the vacation can come alive. So this is the way, using Jungian philosophical categories, I've actually analyzed this sequence. A splendidly realized depiction of the aesthetic attitude in action can be found in Jacques Tati's film Mr. Hulot's Holiday, 1953. On the last night of his vacation, the hero, a likable, bumbling, extroverted intuitive, lights a match in a dark shed that turns out to be a storehouse for fireworks. The pandemonium that ensues is some of the most thrilling, exquisitely choreographed chaos one could ever hope to experience. Tati's spectacular scene is an example of what Samuel Taylor Coleridge's biographer, Richard Holmes, presents in his book, Darker Reflections, as Coleridge's conception of beauty. And this is Coleridge speaking. Beauty as an explosion of energy, perfectly contained. Beauty as an explosion of energy, perfectly contained. I think that's what we saw on the screen. Expertly portrayed by Tati himself with his demonic extroverted sensation on full display, Mr. Hulot imagines at first that he'll be able to gain control over the fireworks. He attempts to extinguish them by opening a nearby hose bib, but the hose is firmly attached to the spigot. The hose's other end is coupled to a rotary sprinkler, which our hero chases in a circle as it spins. The bursting fireworks light up the sky around the hotel where other vacationers are staying and even fly in through an open window. Everyone is awakened. The energy soon ignites their enthusiasm. A Victrola is inadvertently started up and begins playing loud jazz, at which point we experience, in common with the vacationers, a cultural form that can actually contain the energy Hulot has brought to their on-holiday boredom. In other words, they're ready for the jazz, the American jazz now. The entire community is somehow able to join in creating a cultural attitude that is receptive to this eruption. This is the aesthetic attitude. Tati cuts back to Mr. Hulot, who now carries without harm a linked pair of Catherine wheel fireworks as they twirl. They're like two sparkling centers of consciousness, but also like a bicycle, a new vehicle for him. We recognize Mr. Hulot, the persona employed by Jacques Tati, as a character who has become an artist, lit up by the possibility of being conscious of his effects. At that point, we can say that the director's aesthetic attitude has been completely constructed. Indeed, it was with this film that Jacques Tati became recognized as a cinema auteur. Coleridge, one of the greatest and most psychological of philosophers of art, as I said, anticipates my argument just as surely as he anticipated Tati's effect. Coleridge, writing in 1814 about the effect, and he was standing in front of a painting, of the sportive wildness of the component figures. This was in Raphael's fresco Galatea, which he had viewed with his painter friend Washington Allston, and as the biographer Richard Holmes recounts, together they had discovered Raphael's principle of harmony, a monumental circular structure within a central group, the old coach wheel, geometrically controlled by a multiplicity of rays and chords. But Coleridge used a striking scientific analogy to sum up the harmonious beauty of Raphael's composition in one of his most original pieces of art criticism. He praised the balance, the perfect reconciliation effected between these two conflicting principles of the free life and of the confining form. How entirely is the stiffness that would have resulted from the obvious regularity of just the confining form fused, and if I may hazard so bold a metaphor, almost volatilized by the interpretation and electrical flashes of the free life. Now, Holmes is the one who explains this, and so it's really Holmes' phrasing that I turned on to. The chemical image was recalled from Humphrey Davy's method of isolating primary elements with charges from a voltaic battery. Remember the year's 1814, and ever since Benjamin Franklin, people get so excited with all these things that electricity could do. Well, anyway, the charges from a voltaic battery emphasize the dynamic, almost explosive concept that Coleridge had of beauty, or rather, beauty as an explosion of energy, perfectly contained. And I think this gets at the alchemical quality of the energy-releasing union of the opposed principle of free life, extroverted intuition with its sense of endless possibility, and the principle of realism, extroverted sensation with its limiting focus on the actual forms of things. Coleridge's wheel and electrical flashes fully anticipate what Tati would realize on the screen as improbably joined opposites of containment and energy, which for him too is the essence and the deeply comedic capacity of the aesthetic attitude to release from the shock of the unexpected a congenial joy. So to me, what you're watching on the screen and what makes me look at movies is that sometimes a movie constructs a cultural attitude before our very eyes and shows us a new way to live. And that's really what we're talking about. Whether your life is Jung's trying to write psychology, or Tati's trying to make a movie, or just you all taking a vacation, we're all still trying to learn how to live. And we cannot relate to the culture we have to live in it if we don't have a cultural attitude to do so. And so we have to draw on our consciousness, but we also have to stretch it to make room for something other than ourselves. So tomorrow when I have the workshop, I'm going to show you some of how I believe some of the other cultural attitudes are constructed, give you more examples, and give you a chance to work out this idea. Because it's really given me, and I hope psychological types, a new relevance. Thank you. Hello, good morning. I hope people are getting what they need. Now, I gather we're going for about 4 hours today, maybe 4 hours and 15 minutes, which may seem like a long time, but actually, with material as complex as this that needs to be illustrated through film clips that will enable you to see what I'm talking about and feel it and see how it becomes dramatically enacted in our lives, there will be quite a lot of content. So hang on to your seatbelts, as Betty Davis says. This will be a bumpy flight, but it should be a good one. I hope it'll be a good one despite the bumps. Now, let's imagine we will take a break at 10:30, and I really don't mind you getting up and quietly wandering over to the table for food you may have missed. Even while I'm talking, I don't consider that rude. In fact, I'm glad you're taking care of yourself. Please don't announce your review of the food, though, because it might interfere with the attention I need to give to the subject matter. Some of you were here last night. A few of you were not here last night, so that doesn't matter. We're going to start all over again. We're going to cover all the same material, but as always, in a completely different way. So let me start with a very systematic statement that I prepared on one occasion that I will read to you as to what we're talking about. The theme, the title, Cultural Attitudes. This is a very specific idea in Jungian psychology that virtually no one has explored except one Jungian analyst, and that's going to be explained right now. The subject of this workshop is one very close to my heart as a Jungian analyst, since it involves the education of consciousness in ways that I have found to be necessary to enable people to actually manage the difficult task of coping with the world in which they must live. Every working psychotherapist comes to see the enormous anxiety that is generated by the need to take into account not just one's own undiscovered self, whose particularities inevitably limit how one is going to try to cope with life, but also the equal reality of the often unfathomable other who places demands for adaptation that even a very clearly delineated self, honed to identity by a lot of analytic work, can find it challenging to meet. I have come to feel that my job as a therapist is not just to help my patient learn to manage the demanding other any more than it is solely to help that person figure out what type of self they have. My job, rather, is to help the patient construct an attitude that is adequate to bridge the gulf between irreducibly individual self and continuously demanding world. That this happens regularly in an analytical psychotherapy that gives equal weight to self and other has been the miracle I get to see every working week, and I find it just as wonderful as seeing a baby born or an airplane fly. I am witness to something taking off. I have found that the theory of cultural attitudes that Joseph Henderson, and he is the pioneer here, presented to the world in 1985 in a book that was almost completely ignored, offers a theoretical matrix for understanding this miracle. And I have further found that Jung's theory of different types of psychological consciousness, if we understand it as a self-psychology, gives us a way to comprehend how it is possible to stretch one's own native consciousness, one's psychological type, enough to span the gulf between self and other, enough to say that a stable attitude toward otherness has been achieved by the self. Try to keep that in mind. A stable attitude toward otherness has been achieved by the self. The problem of the 20th century was the self. The problem of the 21st century is the other. A stable attitude toward otherness, that's what we're trying to achieve, psychologically, politically, culturally. And what Henderson talked about can help us with that. This workshop, which is really, the work is really you taking me seriously and following the program that I'm going to offer you and engage with it with your hearts and souls, will give me a chance to explain how different types of consciousness achieve that necessary stretch, the stretch from self to other. I will be going into what I mean by culture, by attitude, by self, by other, and by stretch as we go on. And I will be demonstrating what the achievement of a cultural attitude makes possible for a person. We should linger on that word attitude. It's the top word in Jungian psychology. If you're a Freudian, the top word is impulse. Everything is where your impulses come from, what they're aimed at. And of course, in Freud, they're often desirous impulses, sexual impulses. If you're Adlerian, they're power drives. But in Jung, it's something else. What Jung is interested in is the development of attitudes. First of all, figuring out whether one's primary attitude is introverted or extroverted, but moreover, developing over a period of time an attitude toward the unconscious, as opposed to what most people do, is simply handle it by repression, displacement, projection, all the famous defenses that Freud discovered. And that attitude toward the unconscious is much to the point of Jungian psychology. But there's more to attitude than just attitude toward the unconscious. It's the attitude toward culture itself that Henderson decided had not been adequately clarified by Jung. Now, he did get known eventually for his theory that between the personal unconscious that Freud had discovered and the collective unconscious that Jung discovered, there always has been and always will be a cultural unconscious. That idea has been picked up in Jungian psychology, and the hottest thing these days is the discussion of cultural complexes and their cores, which are phantomatic narratives. And the work has been done by Samuel Kimball, who introduced the term cultural complex, and by Tom Singer, who quickly joined him in the exploration of cultural complexes, and then by Sam Kimball again in his book Phantomatic Narratives. And a phantom is some unresolved cultural problem of the past that comes and invades your life in the present, rather like the figure of Beloved in the famous novel by Toni Morrison, if you know that novel. It's about a phantomatic complex of a woman who, in early days of reconstruction, we got to deconstruction 100 years later, reconstruction, an African-American woman imagines that she's put slavery behind, and the baby she killed, not to have that baby grow up as a slave during slave times, comes back now as a young woman, as a phantom, and she has to deal with the unfinished business of slavery. Very remarkable document, one of the great novels of America. Now, this is all cultural unconscious stuff, and we're constantly these days talking about how this and that person is unconscious of some theme in culture, and in fact that gets into political narrative as well. But don't you see this? Oh no, but don't you see that? And so forth and so on. Everyone loves to tell everyone else where they're unconscious. Henderson was more interested in figuring out what cultural consciousness consists of than he was in defining what cultural unconsciousness consists of. Frankly, cultural unconsciousness is obvious. Cultural consciousness is not enough celebrated. It's rare. I remember the early years when, see if I can remember his name as I'm standing up here. Some of you will remember. Do you remember the program Omnibus on what was his name? That wonderful man who would always introduce the Masterpiece Theater. I ran into him in a clothing store once. That wonderful Britisher. Alistair Cook. There was a time when we actually could see on television and enjoy people who thrilled us with their cultural consciousness. And he was one of those people. He just had that, he just personified the attitude toward educating yourself to the world and the civilization. And then, of course, we had people like Kenneth Clark's Civilization. And needless to say, people like in the science world, like Carl Sagan, so forth. Don't those days seem very distant to you right now? Who's enjoying anybody else's cultural consciousness anymore? It's almost as if everyone's trying to tell everyone else what they're unconscious of. So it probably is time to pick up Dr. Henderson's project, as I've tried to do in the last 10 years, and really revisit what cultural consciousness consists of and how differently we develop it, but that we develop it, that we can develop it. There, I think, lies great hope. It always has been great hope. After all, one of the reasons I love Jung so much is how civilized he is. The range of civilization that he had, and it's kind of a beautiful thing when you feel it. Now, Henderson named 4 basic cultural attitudes that he saw as already established in culture before depth psychology arrived. this list he got takes roots in, among other things, William James. So much of good modern psychology does. But Henderson named them in his own way in terms of 4 attitudes already present in most cultures. The religious attitude, the philosophical attitude, the aesthetic attitude, and the social attitude. So I'll say those again. The philosophical, the aesthetic, the social, and the one I named first, the religious attitude. We're going to see a film clip illustrating the construction of a religious attitude, or the deployment of a religious attitude, very shortly. Now, Henderson also saw that since depth psychology appeared, to give us a way to reflect, that's what depth psychology really offered, a way to reflect on our adaptation and its individuation. While those processes of cultural attitudes are actually occurring, we have all begun to approach the development of a cultural attitude of our own as a psychological achievement, and not just a birthright or a byproduct of our education. Think of that. Think of the fact that people in therapy are exploring and reflecting on where they fit into the cultures they come from, and how they've approached them, and how their fathers and grandfathers and mothers and grandmothers approached them, and talking about what was wrong about that, what was right about that, and looking at you and talking about what's right about you and your attitude, what's wrong about you and your attitude, as most people in analysis do with their analysts. Something else entirely is being incubated. The person is not just talking about the past and not just talking about you and what's wrong with your interaction, but the person is trying to get, as they would if they were going to a tailor, a suit that really fits, a dress that's right. A cultural attitude that really works for them. So people do this, and I watch them do this. Other therapists see them do this, and it explains many things in therapy that are otherwise unexplainable. Here's this person coming to see me and paying me what I'm sure is a great deal of money for them, and taking time out of their busy lives. And they keep talking about this rock collection. Why are they spending their time talking about their hobby? Why is someone going on and on about furniture in ancient Egypt or something that they can't seem to stop talking about it? Or what is it that people find important enough to spend time, precious time with me talking about? These days it's amazing how many people come into analysis to talk about what's happening to this country. It's just amazing that that's topic A for most people. And it's amazing that, why me? I mean, they can read newspapers, they can see television, they can choose their news media. There are plenty of places else in our culture where this is being talked about. Is it a resistance? No. What I find that people are doing is building up a cultural attitude in their own way, with the idea that if they can finally get that sense of how it is for them to be living a life that has a cultural history and a cultural present and a cultural future, we hope, is topic A. It is the thing the person needs more than they need to understand their individual complexes, their individual psychological type, their problem with their husband, their problem at work, their problem with their mother, their problem with their father, and so forth. Those are all there, but they seem to be, there needs to be an overarching process going on that I know all that and I still don't feel like I match up in life, and I have to find a worldview. Jung called this, in his writings about psychotherapy, building up a philosophy of life, and that's something that many, many people do, and Jungian therapy is very good for that. Henderson would say that it's also, building up a philosophy of life is not just developing a philosophical attitude toward life, it's developing whichever cultural attitude is appropriate to you, or a mix and match of several of them that may work for you. And how people in analysis today put together a religious attitude, or a philosophic attitude, or an aesthetic attitude, or a social attitude, often involves taking bits and pieces from many that are available, not just one. Now, my aim today is to try to document and unpack the kind of achievement that I see patients in psychotherapy doing. Jung would call psychotherapy an opus, just as if it were a work of art or a special piece of work done by someone. And people often speak of being in psychotherapy as working with an analyst, and they talk about the work. So I'm witness to people doing very interesting cultural work inside themselves and inside my consulting room and in their relations with other people and talking about it. And again, I want to pay homage to that achievement because I watch it every day. So what this seminar is about is documenting and unpacking what that achievement of a cultural attitude can look like. And I'm going to use cultural examples from selected films to illustrate each of the cultural attitudes coming into being in a very credible way before our eyes. You can actually see it happen on the screen if you know how to look for it. And it's right there. It's not hiding in plain sight. It is actually front and center. It is the subject of the films that I'm talking about. The paper I have asked be circulated beforehand that some of you have actually read is chapter 6 of my new book, Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type. But if you haven't read it yet, it still exists, and it's in the book, chapter 6. The stretch of individual typologies in the formation of cultural attitudes. Now, the number 6 is a number that, when it appears in dreams and symbolism, usually refers to creativity. I like to think of the 6-sided cells that make up the beehive, the honeycomb, that kind of thing. Now,
did you intend that a handout be distributed?
Oh yes, that was supposed to have come to all of you when they arrived. Did that come today?
We're doing it now.
Okay. And do all of you have also the 2 handouts from last night? Does everybody have a green handout? So forth? You can have that now, it's fine. Just so you know what's coming. It was like a program. So, chapter 6 is a synchronicity because the creation of a cultural attitude is a creative process. It's something that is actually constructed. It doesn't just happen to us. We're not just born with it. And it's this creativity that I'm trying to release in my patient's attitude toward the problem that has driven them to seek my help. I hope I can count, therefore, on your creative participation in this seminar, which will take you somewhere other than just to the structure of yourself. It will go into the mystery of how self figures out how to relate in a useful way to the culture around it, so that culture will not remain quite so other. To get you there will certainly be my aim as I teach this workshop, and my wish is that you'll find it useful. So that's the program and prospectus. Now, I advise you from time to time to look at this green handout, because when I'm talking about constructing something, I'm saying, well, constructed out of what? It's my view that we are all innately given, comes free of charge from the beginning, without any need for immediate education by parents or others who already think they know what their children should think and feel and sense and intuit. It comes in a very natural way from the beginning and is present, in my opinion, in the womb. We're all given psychological type, an innate preference for certain kinds of consciousness and a certain skill at deploying it long before we have an ego that knows what we're doing when we use our consciousness. So rather than think of the types of consciousness as something that somehow comes as the result of ego development and can be hurried along by parents who want to steer the children in a certain direction, the child already has consciousness in the womb. The introverted feeling fetus at about 6 months can hear the angry voices of the parents quarreling through the uterine wall. And so if that baby who has a strong preference for introverted feeling happens to enter this world with a frown on its face, it's because that family it's been born into has already demonstrated that it does not match up to the archetype of what a family should be. And the family that tries to take that frown off the baby's face is depriving it of its birthright to object. And not infrequently, that produces a very rageful child, sometimes diagnosed as a borderline personality or other, that an analyst has to make room for and finally let that person deliver their protest to what's wrong with the world they find themselves in from the standpoint of what should be there. And if you don't get that, you don't get psychological type. But how many families are trying to wipe that frown off the baby's face? And how much damage do they do on a daily basis? I dream of a time when families will welcome the psychological type of the child rather than treat it as a disease. But boy, that time has still not come. I just want to point that out. Jung gives us the facts of the matter in his book Psychological Types, that there are 8 types of consciousness. Not 2, not 4, but 8. And each of those types of consciousness has what he calls both an attitude type and a function type. So attitude is easy, introverted or extroverted. Function is Jung's specific addition to the subject, which some of us know a great deal about and some of us know very little about. And the 4 functions that he named were thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. So the fact that the functions can be expressed in either the extroverted or the introverted attitude gives us 8 types of consciousness. Now, a type of consciousness does not the whole person make, because people are made up really of all the different types of consciousness. They just have them in a different order and they combine them in different ways. So we have to get to know how each of us is using that birthright of 8 types of consciousness, and above all, to get an idea of which is naturally dominant. Now, of course, we're not that far from the day when left-handed children had their left hand tied behind their back so they would learn to use their right hand as they're supposed to do. And so we're not that far from that with psychological types. So an awful lot of people do not develop their native psychological type because it isn't welcome in their family. Rather, they learn to give the family the psychological type the family seems to want. Every family seems to have a type preference. Every workplace seems to have a type preference. Every university seems to have a type presence. And every country seems to have a type preference. Woe betide any American who can't do extroverted thinking, whether or not you're natively extroverted thinking or not. Everybody's always being asked what their plan for the day is, as if that were the most important thing. I've tried very hard to make these 8 functions of consciousness clearer. And the work that you see here happened in Cleveland in 2010. And some of you were present in the room when it happened, when I just stood at a blackboard and tried to unpack the 8 function attitudes using ing process action verbs, or more precisely, verbal nouns called gerunds. So for me, extroverted sensation is a process that involves engaging and experiencing and enjoying. And introverted sensation is a process that involves implementing and verifying and accounting. And extroverted intuition, my own dominant preference, involves entertaining, envisioning, and enabling. And introverted intuition involves imagining, knowing, and divining. Someone asked me what I meant by divining. It's the ability to see the God in the disease, as Jung said, to be able to see God in things, the God in things. It's very Jungian to divine, to actually see that. Extroverted thinking is regulating, planning, enforcing. Introverted thinking, another function I use to great degree, especially when I teach, involves naming, as I'm doing now, defining, and the aim is understanding, better understanding. Extroverted feeling involves validating, affirming, and relating. A marvelous example of what I mean by validating and affirming and relating is a story that Herb Cain used to tell, living in San Francisco, about the Chinese laundryman. That a young bachelor was taking his clothes to the laundry and to be washed and folded, and the shirts to be ironed and so forth. And one day the man came in and said, "You know, I may not be seeing you as often because I'm engaged now to be married." And the Chinese laundryman immediately said, "Oh, how wonderful. You'll have a wife to take care of you. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. She'll do this. She won't need me anymore. That will be very good." So about 3 weeks later, the man showed up at the laundry again with his laundry, and the laundryman looked at him and said, "How's your fiancée?" "Oh," the man said with a sad look on his face, "We broke up." "You're better off." So obviously that's extroverted feeling, and the Chinese culture is filled with it, and it's a wonderful thing. And that's validating, and it's affirming, and it's relating, and it's charming. Now, introverted feeling can't claim that kind of make you feel good every day, because it often starts with that frown on the face. It seems to need to start by judging something and being introverted, and it's an object out there 9 times out of 10, it's more critical than not. So the first experience is judging. Introverted feeling people hate to be told that they're judgmental because that's not their aim. But they can't help the beginning. They have to start with judging. Please wait a minute, you know, if you don't like the weather of an introverted feeling type, wait a minute. It's like Ohio or San Francisco, it will change. There's an appraising that needs to take place. And the appraising takes time because it takes time to check what you're seeing against your archetype in the background, which is what introverts do. You check against your archetype to see if it suits you, if it matches up, in other words. Introversion is a kind of matching process where does this match up with the archetypes that the introvert is so in touch with, and the extrovert tries to make everything a merger with the outer world, but there's that need to get off by yourself and just know how you feel about something. That's the appraising, if it's in the feeling area. And again, wait a minute, it's not just an appraisal that is like a score. What they're doing is, and that they can get there, establishing the value. And when the value has been established, there's no approval like an introverted feeling type's approval. I always say if you have a party, always invite one introverted feeling type. They may sit in a chair somewhere off in the party and hardly say anything to anyone, and yet they're the tuning fork. And if the feeling atmosphere in the party is good, the person, the introverted feeler, will be smiling in that chair, radiating how good the party feels. And if the party doesn't feel good, it'll be like that baby with the frown on its face. And the good extroverted feeling hostess should attend to that barometer because it's really accurate. But you see, to make room for all these consciousnesses requires that you not, if you happen to prefer extroverted feeling, demonize introverted feeling, and you're not, if you're introverted intuitive, insist that extroversion cannot be associated with intuition, and you can't, if you use thinking, assume that all the definitions have already been made, and you just have to read the encyclopedia, and you have to read the dictionary, and it's all been settled, and you just learn things, and that's all there is to it. There has to room be made for introverted thinking, which is creatively rethinking everything constantly and checking the received ideas against whether they're really true. On and on. Extroverted sensation is so different from introverted sensation that one analyst said he wondered why they even call them both sensation, because they're just so different. The sensation an introvert is concerned with are the sensations on the inside of the body, whether their dinner is distending the abdomen too much. It's that kind of thing, or what's happening inside and very autonomic processes. Whereas extroverted sensation is this immediate merger, and the more sensation, the better. I often think, when we seem to keep having a bumper crop of people diagnosed as Asperger's or autistic, or it's one of our, it just gets larger and larger, the group of people. Have you ever considered what a monstrosity it is to have turned birth into a surgical procedure? Can you imagine what it must feel like for an introverted sensation fetus to emerge from the womb, a baby now, into this overly lit operating room with those terrible metallic sounds and all that clanking and all that nurse and doctor talk and that whole atmosphere? No wonder that child feels immediately overstimulated and starts resorting to defenses of the self and anxiety binding and containing, and may, under certain circumstances, if the parents continue to push an extroverted sensation agenda, keep returning to that introverted sensation withdrawal that they were so comfortable with in the womb. So there can be a pathological persistence of the security of the primal self with all kinds of autistic maneuvers in order to reestablish that internal harmony. Do you have any idea what agony shopping is for an introverted sensation type who's not autistic? Just going into Sears, which now is closed, but it used to be the smell of peanuts would be overwhelming, and in Macy's it's the smell of perfume, and this riot of colors and demands and noises and the sensory-rich environment. It's absolutely exhausting. Ask your introverted sensation type friends how they feel about going shopping. On the other hand, ask your extroverted sensation friends how they could possibly get by without getting out and doing something, and the louder the better. Hard Rock Cafe, the more noise the better, the more sound. Go to the mall during the day and go to the disco at night. In other words, keep the party going. It's a completely different set of priorities. How different we all are. And hopefully you all know this, but I need to say this. This is the starting point. We all have these preferences. We all have these types of consciousness, and we sometimes are lucky enough to have partners, friends, analysts who can accept them. And gradually we can accept them ourselves, our enormous differences from each other. We construct the attitudes by which we fly on the basis of the consciousnesses we start with. But we don't start with the construction of an attitude. We have to have several types of consciousness already available to us before we can construct them into something else. So now I'm going to show you a film clip. And I'm not going to do it this second. I'll tell you when we're ready to start, Gus. But of what happens when you meet a situation for which you could not possibly be prepared. And so we start with being the victim of a social process one barely understands and wasn't born to understand. The movie I'm going to use is Alfred Hitchcock's The Wrong Man from 1956. And I think it's one of the most unrecognized of Hitchcock's films. The more I see it, the more of a masterpiece it appears to me to be. Although it's rarely listed among the masterpieces that most people who study Hitchcock, and Hitchcock is the most studied of all film directors. Actually, film studies in some ways began with the analysis of Hitchcock's films, and especially in the 1960s. And the one that never quite caught on is one I did happen to see first run when I was 17. It stars Henry Fonda, and its title is The Wrong Man. It's based on a true story of a double bass player at the Stork Club in New York, which is a very good assignment, Manny Balistrero. And Manny Balistrero is played by Henry Fonda. He's a man who looks to me to be in his early 40s. He has a wife and 2 children. He lives in Queens. He has this good job. They have a house. but his wife needs dental work, and that's not in their budget. So, with a great deal of shame at having to borrow money, you have to remember what it felt like in the 50s, especially in families that didn't discuss money, how humiliating it was to have to take a loan. The only asset they have is his wife's life insurance policy. So he has to go to the insurance office and borrow money on his life's insurance. So, being Henry Fonda, he comes in a very meek way, is pleasant, has, being a musician, he seems to have very strong introverted sensation and very polite, caretaking, extroverted feeling. So he moves in a particularly cautious, careful way, not to be intrusive in any way, has everything at hand. And so he has his hand in his pocket to be able to pull out the life insurance policy and show the woman at the desk, who from the minute she sees him is absolutely terrified that he's there and keeps looking at his hand there as if something has happened. And it turns out that the insurance office has been robbed a few weeks before by a man who seems to look a little bit like Manny Balistrero. So the woman excuses herself, shaking, and goes back and says, "I think the man is back." And the women in the office all look and they decide. The woman who was waiting at that same woman's place that time can't really bear to look, but she takes a quick glance. They all decide it's the same person, and they call the police. And suddenly Henry Fonda's character is arrested for theft. Now, if you happen to be type literate, absolutely nothing that he did would be other than an attempt to manage shame, to be a good introverted sensation type with extroverted feeling. But because introverted sensation doesn't always show all of its emotions on its face, and caretaking extroverted feeling sometimes is hesitant so as not to be intrusive, it's perfectly easy to see how, under certain circumstances, these courteous behaviors of a good citizen could be misread as shadow behaviors of a criminal. So you can sort of understand how this happened. Apparently in the real story, to make it clearer, the insurance office had been robbed twice before. So the people were really in a post-traumatic stress. In any case, and Manny Balistrero apparently did have an uncanny resemblance to the real thief. But it sometimes seems to happen to sensation types more often, and particularly introverted sensation types more often than it happens to extroverted intuitives like myself. There's something about an extroverted intuitive that knows not to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know how to be in the right place at the right time. People are always saying, "How did you know to call me today? This was the right time to hear from you." I've always had that gift. Introverted sensation types don't have that intuitive gift of when you make the... So he probably went to the office on the wrong day. It was, maybe they decided to borrow from the wrong insurance policy. Who knows? The whole thing was just somehow wrong. And when something's wrong, sometimes there's a lot of synchronicity. There were people that could have testified that there's no possible way Manny could have been the thief that robbed before, because he was with certain people at the time that the other robberies took place. But those people have died or moved away. They can't be found. And so finally, all that's left is the very positive identification of 4 women in the office. And so they're very sure that it's Manny, is the same man. So we're going to meet Manny in the midst of the trial. We're going to meet him in the midst of the trial. So I think is enough of an explanation. So we're ready to look. I want to ask if there's any way to turn off the overhead lights. Does that work? Because it would be nice to not have that while we're looking at the film. So with Hitchcock, it's wonderful how clear and how easy it is to read the types of consciousness. But for those of you who aren't busy thinking about psychological types every minute of your life, it may not be as easy as it is for someone who's trained themselves to recognize them. But I doubt that very many of you would have failed to notice that extraordinary evocation of what introverted sensation is like when the police detective walks past the right man, walks to the street, suddenly tries to place where he's seen that before, locates the thing, goes back, verifies that in fact that face does look enough like Manny that perhaps that is the real. And they check it out, and sure enough, they get the confession. In fact, in real life, the right man, when found, had been following the Ballesteros trial and claimed to the police that if Manny was convicted, he was planning to come forward. I don't believe that at all, but the point is, the detective is using introverted sensation. I hope you could see how much the mother, who is a very unusual figure in Hitchcock's films because she's a minor character who's not a particularly good actress. In fact, she's a rather bad actress, and that is a tip-off that Hitchcock means her to be some kind of shadow figure that's not to be fully taken seriously by Manny himself, something he doesn't usually use. But it's obvious to me that she's using introverted intuition, and that she actually, the movie is filled with all kinds of things, including the obvious issues around class and upper mobility. Manny is working at the Stork Club, which is an upper class nightclub, very famous in New York. And he's living in a middle class home in Queens with a wife who looks like she might be she's a blonde, she might be of Scandinavian or Germanic background. Manny is Italian with an Italian last name, Ballesteros, and his mother is still speaking with an accent, still an immigrant, and still has the folk superstition of Italy, including something that's very typical of Italians that any introverted, intuitive Italian would be extraordinarily aware of, as Manny's mother was, malocchio, the evil eye, and the fact that just when things are going well, that's often when one is targeted for a little bit of the unfairness of the divine. So she is aware that evil is afoot and is undermining Manny. And the very name Manny, I'm sure Hitchcock would have known that Manny is the same as Mani, the great 3rd century AD person that Jung named as one of the 4 pillars of the spirit he relied upon. That list is so interesting. Moses, the Buddha, Jesus, and Mani, who would name Mani, the founder of Manichaeism? That St. Augustine has this whole long thing about the Manichaeans. He used to sit and watch their rituals, and he has this long, angry attack on them. They were very popular. The Manichaean religion was the first truly world religion. It reached all the way from Iran to China, and the Chinese were, as I was saying last night, there were still Manichaeans practicing in China as late as the 19th century, and many caves that Jung was very interested in had extraordinary Manichaean drawings. The Manichaeans had the distinction of holding on within a more or less Christian context to the old Zoroastrian idea that there are two forces, the evil force and the good force, and somehow they found a way to enable one to have a good Christian God who nevertheless could not control directly the evil force, and that it was the human being's job to take up the problem of evil and somehow dilute it in their own way with good, but not deny its presence. And of course, Manny's Italian mother instinctively and intuitively understands all of this psychology, which is that when you are faced with undeserved suffering and evil has been visited on you because of the evil eye in some way, it's then incumbent upon you to find the strength to contain the experience. So she tells Manny correctly not to pray for help, but to pray for strength. The strength to be able to take into oneself what the evil is doing, and somehow that is the process that enables us to survive it, and with our faith intact, our faith in God intact. All of that is handled by Hitchcock so beautifully and just visually. He doesn't do it with sound at all. It's a series of images that's incredible. But that moment when the wrong man's face enters Manny, and then at last comes the divine healing synchronicity. When that piece of the divine work is done, that the mother divines, then the synchronicity can take place, so that Manny has to pray for the strength to accept the entry of the evil into himself, which he's resisting. He wants to be rescued from that. No, evil has entered his life. But that becomes the synchronicity, once he can accept it, that enables another introverted sensation type to make the discrimination, find the right man, and so that's the miracle that takes place. So Manny also gets the help he wants, but only by praying for the strength to endure the undeserved suffering. It's an amazing, amazing religious sequence. And so between the detective with his introverted sensation and the mother with her introverted intuition, Manny praying, the good mother's boy, realizes the shadow of the man with the negative mother complex who comes upon another immigrant woman and threatens her and so forth, and she can deal with him. It's an amazing moment at which the shadow is made conscious, and as a result, that which cannot be made conscious happens to one as fate. If one can make it conscious, the fate can be reversed. So there we have a law that Jung endlessly talked about. That is Jung who said the psychological rule is that that which a person cannot make conscious happens to them as fate. The problem with Henry Fonda is it's too good. He's a man with a positive mother complex who hasn't realized the negative mother complex yet. Von Franz says a person who has a positive mother complex in their conscious has a negative mother complex in their unconscious, and vice versa. And part of the job of analysis is the realization of the shadow. If you don't realize the shadow, it keeps happening to you as outer event. It's an amazing piece of work. So do you see a religion? There's Jesus with the heart. And again, by the standards of 1950s upward mobility, both the mother and the Jesus on her wall were in bad taste. It was kitsch. We no longer make those distinctions between high and low, and I find it rather beautiful, actually, and I rather like it. But that wasn't the way a 50s man that, like Manny would have read it, who was working at the Stork Club. But it doesn't matter. Religion had fallen into shadow by the 50s. It was something that was seen by many people, and still is by many, as superstition. But what Hitchcock constructs, and of course he was himself Catholic, what he constructs in this is the emergence of a religious attitude that is strong enough, the strength Manny needs to be able to cope. And I have never seen it done more economically anywhere in any text than in this movie. I think it's amazing. Did you all get it? Did you see it? Could you feel it? If you can feel that, you get the whole seminar, really. I'm going to give you 3 other examples, if we have time, of different other cultural attitudes being constructed. But if you watched what happened, you see what I'm talking about.
You go through life with a religious dimension, a religious understanding, which I've been through, because
Yes.
I read a good scenario.
Sure.
Let me talk a little louder. If you go through life with a serious religious dimension, trained and also practiced, where you go through life and you know what's coming, you don't know why, you can't explain it, but you trust it, then you're in a good place. You're in a religious dimension of highest soul. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that a religious attitude is enormously helpful, and that it puts you in a better place. I don't think Manny was in a good place, but he was in a better place. And when I say I don't think he was in a good place, his wife went into a psychotic depression and had to be hospitalized. She became convinced that she had caused everything and was in a paranoid, intrapunitive state. And she remained in a mental hospital for 2 years after Manny was found to be the right man, and they finally went to Florida, started all over again. And the people have studied the family. There was an article about it not long ago in a newspaper, and about what happened to them. And although the movie says that she eventually recovered from her depression, it was only a partial recovery. Once she had met the possibility of undeserved misfortune and wondered if she had somehow done something wrong to cause it, some kind of probably Lutheran guilt just had caught up with her, and she never fully recovered from that. So by no means would I say that Manny was in a fully good place, but what he was given was the strength to contain the problem of evil rather than simply project it. However, Manny this Manny with M-A-N-N-Y is not Mani, M-A-N-I. When he looks at the man and says, "Do you realize what you've done to my wife?" and then we can see the pain on the other man's face with this introverted feeling, and the man is being treated as if he has no shame or guilt when he obviously does. Then Manny, who has gone through what it is to be charged as a criminal, doesn't seem to have learned the lesson of empathy for what it must be like to be the right man. And so the process goes on. In other words, the process of integrating the understanding of evil is a very long process, and we would so much prefer to locate the shadow outside ourselves than to recognize that this can happen to any of us. So it's a very tough text. I often, when I look at the courtroom scenes where you see the prosecuting attorney listening to a dirty joke and the people gossiping and so forth, I feel like I'm looking at one of those paintings by Hieronymus Bosch, in which there's all these terrible, malicious, nasty people around. The nastiness of life is all over this film, and the problem of evil is all over this film. But the religious attitude is in it, and the religious attitude is demonstrated to have a power and to be a player in being able to survive some of these awful things that are visited on us. That's all, but I wouldn't go farther than that. Okay, I think we should take a little break and then come back in about 12, 15 minutes.
This is the end of CD number 1. The lecture continues on CD number 2.
Now, you may have noticed something that I think is very important about the construction of a cultural attitude. A cultural attitude seems to be composed of two psychological type. What I want to call them is the technical term function attitudes. But let's just say for the moment, two types of consciousness that are quite different from each other, but have one thing in common, which is their attitude type is the same, and another thing in common, which is they're either both rational or both irrational. Now, I make that very technical set of observations because we just combined introverted intuition and introverted sensation to make a religious attitude. So not only faith, but signs and wonders, actual verifiable signs, like the synchronicity of God's existence, not just the knowing that there is a God, but the evidence that the prayer had an effect. Now, introverted intuition plus introverted sensation combine two introverted functions that are both irrational in character, according to Jung. That is, sensations and intuitions are both given to us. They're just what is. They're not what somebody thought up or felt was good. They just are. They are what is. Or they are what are. So they're given. They're not optional. So what was being strengthened in Manny, therefore, was his introverted side. Now I want to show you something else entirely. I want to show you the construction of a social attitude that is made up of two rational functions that are both extroverted. So I'm going to show you the construction of a social attitude which combines extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling to create an incredibly potent and successful social attitude that I watched constructed in my own time, in my own city, with outstanding political success. A model for what it might look like if we could create an effective social attitude that was also politically unitive in the country as a whole, which we've not been able to do because we cannot seem to bring extroverted thinking, policy, and extroverted feeling under emotional intelligence together. Rather, they're leading split-off lives literally right at the border of our country. Now, the movie that I'm going to show you the clip from is by Gus Van Sant, a gay director who made the movie Milk about an authentic gay hero from San Francisco who created a social attitude out of absolutely nothing that eventually led everywhere in this country to a true transformation of social attitude generally around one very sensitive issue, the issue of the homosexual minority within a dominantly heterosexual world and country. And you know that that's one achievement politically in our time. Now I'd like you to see how this happened, because Gus Van Sant really did a good job of telling the story of how it was brought together. And the character of Harvey Milk, as played by Sean Penn brilliantly, apparently Sean Penn was the homophobe of all time when he was married to Madonna, and when he actually made this movie, he got on the phone to his ex-wife and said, "You won't believe this, but I've actually kissed a man." As if to say belatedly that he'd finally figured out something that wasn't present when they were married, and she had to have him in jail for hitting on her. So be it. Sean Penn did a remarkable self-transcendence to make this part of extroverted feeling Harvey Milk. Now, there's another character that Harvey Milk meets in the course of what you're going to see, who's very important in the construction of the social attitude, but he's also a real-life figure that some of you know, whose own life has been shown as a mini-series that was also written by the same screenwriter who wrote Milk. Some of you know the name of Cleve Jones, the AIDS activist who eventually made the quilt that was shown all over the country of all the people, memorializing all the people who died of HIV in this, AIDS actually, HIV leading to AIDS in this time, a remarkable thing. And Cleve Jones was an activist, but like everything else Harvey Milk touched, this came out of the most unpromising beginning between extroverted feeling Harvey and extroverted thinking Cleve Jones. Now that is going to start, that meeting will take place in the middle of the clip I'm showing you. What I'm going to show you is Harvey Milk from the first moment that he began to have stirrings that perhaps political action was concerned. He came to San Francisco after the age of 40 with a new lover that he had formed a relationship with in New York City. And up until then, Harvey had done very little with his life. He ran a little photography shop, camera equipment shop in the Castro district of San Francisco, which at that time was very much a gay area, but also very much under police harassment at the time. So that as the clip opens, you're looking at the Castro of the early 1970s, and you're looking at the beginnings of Harvey Milk's stirrings toward being politically important. I remember those early years when Harvey Milk was running for any kind of office. People would snicker and say, "What's he running for? Dairy Queen?" and so forth and so on. And so that's where things were at that time. Little did people know what was ahead. So what was ahead will be shown in the clip I'm showing you. Well, we can stop there. We can have the lights again. So I hope you could see, of course, the common enemy in Anita Bryant didn't hurt. You can see in this wonderful evocation just how the social attitude that made the gay movement a political force comes together. Could you see the extroverted thinking of Cleve Jones, and could you see the extroverted feeling of Harvey Milk? And that wonderful way that Art Agnos put his finger on exactly where the problem lay. I think he's an important character in this. I think he had the introverted thinking to define the problem. was that it's not just enough to be against something, you also have to be for something. Now, being for something is what extroverted thinking does. Extroverted thinking develops a plan. The extroverted feeling protest that people are not being kind enough, affirming enough, and criticizing people for the poverty of their extroverted feeling was all true, but it wasn't enough. The enough was Cleve Jones and this other bit, which is that ability to directly state in a clear way what the alternative would be, what it would look like, what needs to happen. So the two halves coming together make a social attitude. Anyone who's been effective at taking an extroverted feeling gift for affirming other people and actually running an effective charity or being an effective organization always understands this need to bring extroverted feeling and extroverted thinking together. The individual extroverted thinking types usually don't think much of the extroverted feeling types, and the usual extroverted feeling types usually find the extroverted thinking types cold and critical. And so you could see Harvey Milk and Cleve Jones working out their antipathy at the beginning, and it's very witty and very charming and very interesting the way Harvey Milk didn't give up. I think that was part of his genius, that he would use his extroverted feeling in such a way that he actually made room for difference. But it takes both coming together to make the movement. What I find this extraordinary in this film is that more than just about any other film I've been able to find, it actually shows a social attitude being constructed. So I wonder if all of you could see it that way too, if you could actually see the processes I'm talking about, how you take two very different consciousnesses that shouldn't really be able to speak to each other, bring them together, and you have something more than either. An attitude is created that actually has some span that can actually hold things. A cultural attitude helps someone to deal with the world because it holds opposites. There's a moment in The Wrong Man, which I showed you earlier, where in the delicatessen, now that her husband has gotten hold of the wrong man, she's speaking to the police that she's called, and they obviously say, can you hold them? Can you hold him? Because she says, yeah, we can hold him. I pay very close attention to that word hold. A cultural attitude is established when you can hold something together. The I Ching has a hexagram. Some of you know the I Ching pretty well, I suspect. And perhaps you know hexagram 8, which says union, or holding together. A cultural attitude holds together, and it holds us in society, the difference between self and other that is the problem of society, because we've already brought together and are holding together opposites within ourselves that enables us to hold our relation to the outer world. That's the mystery, that's the thing. So in this case, with the Harvey Milk story, I showed you two rational extroverted functions. Jung calls thinking and feeling the rational functions. They're the functions where people actually have options. You could see Harvey Milk exercising his options. Like many extroverted feeling types, he keeps changing his persona. He keeps trying different options, different strategies. And you could see also Cleve Jones having options. He opted to see politics as bourgeois. Then he went to Spain and he saw politics as essential. He keeps changing his options too. Thinking and feeling are rational in the sense that reason can make one decide how to deploy them, as opposed to sensation and intuition, which are just given. So when I was doing the religious attitude, I was dealing with introverted sensation, which would be the fact that Manny is the wrong man. That had to somehow come to light. And that came to light through the detective, remembering that he'd seen someone, when he saw the right man, he remembered when Manny had come in, and that face looked a little bit like Manny's. He found it, then thought of what that might mean, verified it, and made the connection. All that was done through something that no one could control, which was that there was a fact hiding in plain sight. It just had to be found. And then the mother's religious faith. She just knew, she understood instinctively that God works in strange ways and that sometimes evil appears, and that that's the moment at which the cardinal virtue of strength is required, fortezza. That's what's needed, force. And that mother's strength is enacted by the man in the delicatessen holding the right man who is carrying the problem of evil that has intruded itself into Manny's life. But his praying enables the man to come into his life and on the scene and be found in time to save him from going to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Now, there we're looking at two introverted functions, introverted intuition and introverted sensation, and they're both irrational functions. So let's take another look at the construction of yet another cultural attitude from a totally charming film about a child. I bring this up because cultural attitudes do not require you to be in the second half of life having read Jung and been in Jungian analysis for 20 years. That isn't a requirement. As nearly as I can tell, the cultural attitude being constructed in the film I'm about to show you takes place in the life and mind of a 6-year-old child. And the movie is one that somehow escaped notice by most people, but was one of the finest movies I've seen in the last 10 years. Have any of you seen the movie What Maisie Knew? It's a lovely film by a couple of very good filmmakers named Scott McGehee and David Siegel. They've done other movies such as Bee Season that you may have seen. They're very smart directors that learned to met at the Rhode Island School of Design and have an enormously beautiful visual sense. And so they're quite appropriate to what I'm about to show you, which is the construction of an aesthetic attitude, because their movie is quite beautiful. It's based on a novel that I read when I was in college by Henry James called What Maisie Knew, which was set in 1890s London, which was about what was then an unusual situation about a little girl whose parents are divorced, and each is too busy for her, but each has developed another partner, and so she has a stepfather and a stepmother. And the stepfather and the stepmother are actually better caretakers of her when she shifts between the two parents. So she spends a lot of time with her stepfather and she spends a lot of time with her stepmother. And in the course of trading Maisie off between the two families, the step-parents become aware of each other. And as it turns out, the people they're married to have already lost interest in them as well, but the step-parents become very interested in each other. And so what Maisie knew is that the reason that the people that are taking care of her is because they want to be with each other. And so the child has to deal with being rejected by her actual parents and being used by the step-parents. Now, all of this is transmuted in the most lovely way and transposed to contemporary New York City, and Maisie's mother becomes a rock star, a singer, played by the wonderful Julianne Moore, and Maisie's stepfather, who's just married Julianne Moore, but not yet known as this clip begins to Maisie, is played by Alexander Skarsgård, a wonderful, wonderful young actor from Sweden who plays Americans with a flawless accent, so he's very good. He was the abusive husband in the what is the film? Small Little Secrets. I can't quite say the name, but that was on television this past year. He's a great actor. The father only appears very briefly. He's a rock promoter, and he's recently married the governess that Maisie's mother had hired. So there's a tremendous tension that the mother's ex-husband has now married the governess. And so Maisie's mother doesn't really like to speak to the governess. She doesn't really like to speak to her ex-husband. And there are always custody problems around picking up Maisie because the father tends to be irresponsible. So at this point, the movie begins with the clip that I'm going to show you. Maisie has been the flower girl at her father's wedding to the woman that had been her governess, who's probably the person that Maisie has experienced the most caretaking from. And so Maisie, carrying the flowers from the wedding, then has to wait to be picked up by someone, and that's what you're going to see, the problem of joint custody, a child in New York, abandonment, and a very complicated set of erotic relations. How it's what you would call an ugly situation. And the problem at hand is how to find any beauty in this situation. Beauty is often the rescuer in situations. People often think that it's going to be religion, or it's going to be social, or it's going to be philosophic, but sometimes it's aesthetic. And that's why I want to show you. The aesthetic attitude gives privilege to beauty. And the beautiful often becomes what feels true. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know, said Keats. Beauty is certainly a kind of truth for the person who's able to use the aesthetic attitude. And it often can solve problems that cannot literally be solved in any other way. And I think this film text I'm going to show you illustrates that absolutely beautifully. So let's take a look at it. It does draw you in. Can we have the lights? Now, did you catch the final moment when he's made the beautiful food and she doesn't want to eat it? He says, I thought you were hungry. And she said, I didn't want to ruin it. What's come together in this little girl's chaotic life with these narcissistic parents, the witchy, extroverted feeling mother who's so envious that she has to get married to him, and then so envious of him even starting to bond with her daughter that she has to bring her into the control room. And the probably introverted thinking father, you only got a glimpse of him, who had to marry his daughter's governess and then can't seem to have enough feeling to even show up on pickup day for his daughter. So she has these totally dreadful parents. archetypally a witch and a trickster. I mean, she says it's a witch hunt. There isn't anybody watching her performance that doesn't know who the witch is at that particular moment. Strange how that turns that term. But the situation is really not beautiful at all. In fact, it's very ugly. At that moment when we see Maisie, the little girl, with the governess having left, having to cross the street with this man she's just met and learned is married to her mother. For that few moments on the screen, the little girl looks really ugly, actually. She feels ugly and she looks ugly. The rest of the time she looks like a interesting little girl. But that moment, beauty has abandoned her. And you can see it. The filmmakers are just extraordinarily good with the aesthetic effects of this film. But by the end of the sequence, an aesthetic attitude has been constructed, and there is something beautiful. And she doesn't even want to eat it because it would ruin it. So you get the feeling that she has somehow managed to bring something together with the help of Lincoln. Now, Lincoln's psychological type seems to me utterly clear in the moment when he smells the crayon and then busies himself using it. I don't think any other type than extroverted sensation would do that. And I think watching him constantly engage with the impossible situation he finds himself in, he's kind of a wonderful, wonderful image of, in some ways, he's still very much a boy, and he makes a kind of a marvelous, almost older brother to Maisie. It's very, very touching. Maisie's psychological type may be harder for some of you to read. I didn't have much trouble with it, but of course I wouldn't, because I recognize her as an extroverted intuitive. But there is one place where I think it's utterly clear, and it's so accurate to how people like me and Maisie steer through life, and there's a lot of commonality in our upbringings. But I've always been able to find my way, and I've always found my way by kind of following my nose and reading the signs. Maisie has this moment when she's determined not to be with this man. She hasn't gotten her way. The only person she knows and loves, really, the governess, has gone off with her father, and now she had been the flower girl, but now she's been essentially discarded. And her mother doesn't come to pick her up. Lincoln comes to pick her up, and she's feeling awful. And she sees the street sign, and she sees a hand, and she sees the person walking. And it's kind of beautiful, and she reads the signals, and she takes Lincoln's hand, and they cross the street together. She follows the signs. It's just what extroverted intuitives do. They pick up wisps of things in the outer world, and that guides them as to what to do next. It's a totally irrational function. I've been doing it my whole life, and it's gotten me everywhere. But to me, that's an incredibly poignant movement. But of course, they're not a couple yet, but she's decided to accept the situation. Not that it's what she had envisioned for herself, but it's the way things are going, and so she's going to try to see what she can do with it. So she at least entertains the possibility of relating to this man, and very soon she's doing a drawing, and she wants to have him help her. And she wants him to tell her what to do next, but he says it's your drawing, and so they're a little bit awkward with each other. And then, but essentially, they're constructing a bridge. It's quite neat. This is what the stretch is. There's the stretch, the boat, the bridge to the castle. She's constructing the bridge. So, despite the mother's envious attack on their starting to make their connection with each other, it starts to develop into something, and so that magical moment when he's able to cook for her as he's learned to prepare bar food in his work as a bartender, he makes something very beautiful, and they have created beauty together. And that is going to be the salvation of Maisie, because by the end of the movie, Lincoln will have formed the relationship with her father's wife, her governess. They will have a beautiful home, and Maisie will be happy there. And when Mother comes to visit, she sees immediately that Maisie does not want to go back with her, but she wants to stay with them, and the mother sacrifices to that. So rather than the terrible irony of Henry James' novel, we have something altogether more beautiful that, again, out of seemingly nowhere, by bringing together the right couple of functions, something can be created that will create something that can be a holding environment for a certain kind of child. Very, very touching, very beautiful. And it speaks very much to me because it reminds me of so many things that I've had to put together in exactly that same way, being led by beauty. Beauty is a wonderful attitude. The aesthetic attitude is a wonderful savor. I could say more and more and more about it, but let's just say that the aesthetic attitude is frequently depreciated, but it's not a simple thing at all. And Henry James understood it, and these two film directors understand it very well. Maybe this is a moment to just take a couple of questions about this, because you've seen two very different kinds of coming together of extroverted functions in a row. Extroverted feeling and extroverted thinking, rational functions, Harvey Milk and Cleve Jones. And then you've seen Maisie and Lincoln coming together. So extroverted intuition and extroverted sensation. Could you feel the difference in the worlds? Could you feel the difference between the rational world of debate and argument and the world of impression, and whether sensations are pleasing or displeasing, and whether a situation is ugly or beautiful, whether it can be improvised in a beautiful direction or torn apart in an ugly direction by failure to pick up, failure to make connection, the difference between Lincoln and not being picked up. Did it speak to you? I mean, do these clips, these different worlds speak to you? Because each world, and if you go back, could you feel the different atmosphere, the heavy atmosphere of potential despair in which the religious attitude is the only possible salvation in the wrong man? I mean, in other words, the very different atmosphere. The movies, these three movies, have incredibly different visual styles, atmospheres, dialogue. What's important? You can feel the different attitudes if you watch them in this way. Yes.
John, appreciate hearing this for my second or third time. And what's always hard for me is dealing with that other function, which is in my unconscious, so that I don't see it. But earlier I was talking about how I was using my extroverted thinking and then realizing that I was in a situation where I was creating the social attitude. I needed to sell a church building, and I made the decision in January, and all the feeling types said, "No, we can't do that."
Of course they
So
did.
the minister leaves in July, and they said, "You have to have a monthly meeting, and you have to tell us what the agenda is." So all these feeling types are then telling me all these extrovert thinking things I need to do. So we are now in the process of selling the building, and of course I don't know what all the feeling types are thinking, being an extroverted thinking type, but that's not funny, I don't.
Extroverted thinking types are always funny to everybody else. That was, Katharine Hepburn was able to pull that off brilliantly in The African Queen. She was always making extroverted thinking funny, especially in a woman. But go ahead.
Yes. So, but it's creating that space where the feeling types can get the information, they're not forced to make a decision, and then, you know, they're feeling heard and included in a process.
Well, without that join, you can't move church, right?
Right.
So you're beginning to get their routine, and they're beginning to get your routine. They can't feel good about it unless they tell you to make plans, even though when you told them what the plan was, they treated you like you were an idiot. At the feeling level, you can't do that. But when they tell you, you have to, they're giving you a parliamentary procedure as if you didn't know what that was, and you have to have the extroverted feeling grace not to shame them by saying, well, I've been telling you to do that all along. How good are you doing, Ken? Are you willy-nilly developing some extroverted feeling because you got it?
We are in a good place.
Yeah.
I guess I was just kind of thinking about how with these cultural attitudes, because these couplings of functions in the same attitude,
Yes.
that there's, we're looking, it's interesting to hear you talk about it going through it.
Same extroverted attitude or
Same
introverted
attitude,
attitude,
right,
yes.
So that they're both, so for the religious both being introvert,
Right.
that it's implicit that that as we stretch, we're always stretching into the ego dystonic kind of, that's always part of
You're
it.
stretching into something ego dystonic, and that it doesn't happen if you don't. Now, what do we mean by something that isn't ego dystonic? Let's just be sure that everyone gets this. Ken, in your case, being an extroverted thinking type man, if you'd been reading Jung diligently, as I was doing for years, you would know that introverted feeling is your inferior function, and you would think you'd done a lot by connecting to introverted feeling and not misunderstanding introverted feeling in other people, but making room for it and understanding that people would sometimes resist your plans for introverted feeling reasons, and that you'd learn to tolerate. You hadn't been great at it, but something in you over time got the picture. But now you're thrown by life a curve. Your resistance is not from introverted feeling types. That was what you should have been able to, in the second half of life, to get used to. Your own introverted feeling anima should have come up to some degree to give you a spine, and it did. But now you've got to deal with extroverted feeling. You almost want to say, I didn't study no extroverted feeling, you know. I mean, this isn't in my job description. So why I thought individuation was what you found yourself, and then you let other people be themselves and you be yourself. But they're not letting you be yourself, and yet you've got to deal with them, and they're the people you've got to deal with. What a trick this seems. That's where the stretch is required. The stretch is from the spine to something like this, you see. It's ungainly. It's almost too much to ask. I mean, look at Maisie's situation at 6. It's enough that you lose your governess to your father, who doesn't even pick you up on time, And now I got to deal with my mother's husband when I'm just walking away from my father's wedding. I mean, it's this is too much. Anyone would find it too much. The stretch always feels like too much. Yes?
Can you go back to the mic?
Yes, I'm sorry. The stretch always feels like too much. Yes?
Did it feel like too much to Maisie? That moment where she reached her hand up and took his was, to me, really significant.
It was, but it wasn't what she was aiming to do. She said, I don't want to go home with this man. She didn't happen till she saw the sign on the street.
And I would have never gotten that. I would have thought, oh, she still has this trust. She has maintained this trust in herself.
Well, you missed a step. In movies, nothing is wasted. There was no reason for the film directors to show the hand and the walking, except to motivate her hand taking his and walking against her emphatic determination to not say goodbye to her governess and not have to go with that man. And then she read the situation. That's what extroverted intuition does. That's what I do. I've had to read the situation and go exactly the opposite way from what I'm feeling again and again in my life with divorced parents who couldn't get along and made life impossible. It's how you survive. You do it by reading. If you have intuition, you do it by reading the signs. You don't do it by knowing. Believe me, I didn't have innate trust. Many's the time I didn't want to do something and decided to do it because it was survival. And I could read the signs when it was to do and when I could resist. Yeah.
Wasn't it also significant that he walked back to the curb for Maisie? You know, he starts off and he's crossing the street and he notices that she's not with him. And he makes that extra effort to walk back and wait with her?
I think maybe, but we're not sure. I think it was significant for you, and I think you read Lincoln correctly. Lincoln's body language was always consistent, that he was trying to make the best of a bad situation and trying to engage with her. But I don't think she just automatically trusted him. What she did was somehow see intuitively that against all appearances, this might turn out. She was willing to take the gamble. It was the only play. Actually, the truth was, it was the only real sensible play she had left. But nevertheless, that she made it. I mean, there would be another movie where you'd have to see him dragging her, kicking and screaming because the child just couldn't do it. And there are many children that couldn't make that shift. I mean, the situation is appalling. But you're seeing everything that's on the screen, all of you. You're all right. I mean, all those things ultimately are there. So I'm just trying to give you the way the types work. Yeah.
She seemed to take another sign when she was with her mother, and her mother said, say goodbye to Lincoln. And she said goodbye. And so, again, to me, another stretch, but a sign was given to her.
Right. She seemed to know how to do that. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I remember that, and her mother said, as I remember it, say goodbye, Lincoln. And she said goodbye. So she's still, I thought, that she's keeping her.
Oh, definitely. She doesn't. Who is this man? I mean, what is this situation? What? She's supposed to now, this half-naked man walking around the house. I mean, what is this? But yes, she's getting cues, and she listens, and she picks up the cues. But of course, it's Lincoln himself that wins her over by what they can create together. And they can create something beautiful together, and that's the unexpected thing. And that beats all.
This is kind of aside from the movie, but I would, the discussion brought to mind, sort of on the collective level, folk singing that brought sort of the age of 60s.
Oh, yes.
And people like Bob Dylan.
Yes.
Who basically guess would be what, SE or some kind of extroverted.
I think he was an introverted intuitive using inferior extroverted sensation in the most unitive way with the extroverted intuition of the period. Just amazing.
He seemed to be paired with Pete Seeger, who was the one that took folk music and gave it sort of to the masses, showed them how to play it, published songbooks and that kind of thing.
He had that. Pete Seeger had that. The Weavers had that. That was wonderful, but they didn't have that magic of what Bob Dylan once called my lousy harmonica. His inferior extroverted sensation was exactly what the extroverted intuition needed. It created an astonishing join in a certain moment in time. It was irresistible. Yeah. Now, since we're on the theme of children and how they grow up and how they find their way, which more and more is the case, that the children have to bring themselves up. The parents are all over the map. Or it seems that way to some children. I shouldn't be too hard on parents, because parents work incredibly hard to make life possible for their children in all kinds of ways. But despite their best efforts, sometimes the parents can only do so much. So the contemporary child in film is a very interesting subject that I've been following for a while, and is something I'm working on talking about more at some point. But I was given a chance to write about, actually to talk about the contemporary child in 21st century film, and this was not a title of my selection. Usually things that I develop come to me from outside as invitations from other people, and sometimes the very subject is imposed on me. I don't just impose the subject on the audience. I mean, sometimes I do, but very often I just follow and so I was so happy to get this opportunity, and so I gave a talk a year ago in Los Angeles to the Jung Institute of Los Angeles on the contemporary child in 21st century film. So naturally, the child in Moonlight, if you remember that movie, and the boy in a movie called 20th Century Women, naturally Maisie. But one text that I chose on that occasion that I want to share with you now, because it's such a good example of how a philosophic attitude is developed by an introverted thinking type who from his earliest days wants to be a philosopher, but is a kind of lousy philosopher. He's a sort of a lousy philosopher, but he gradually finds his way to, by the end of the film, to developing, with the help of an introverted feeling young woman that he meets, finally is able to develop what I would call a true philosophic attitude, is the extraordinary movie by Linklater, Boyhood. Some of you saw that. It was filmed in Texas over a period of 12 summers. So the same actor, and nobody died. So the same cast of characters was able to get together and take the next year in a boy's life from the age of 6 to the age of 18. Eric Linklater is just a gigantic human being. I actually saw the film screened in San Francisco, and he talked to the audience after, and I have never seen anybody more totally receptive to an audience and so totally validating of everyone. So he must have extraordinary extroverted feeling. His character, however, for whatever reason, the boy he uses as kind of alter ego for some of his own developments, is not an extroverted feeling type, but rather an introverted thinking type. So you go figure. The director has perfect extroverted feeling, but the character has this very independent introverted thinking from the beginning. So I'm going to show you some sequences from the from the beginning of Boyhood and then from the end. So let's just look together, Gus, at what we're going to do. So we start with chapter 1, and then I'll have to tell you when to stop, and then we'll go to chapter 16. I hope we can get subtitles if possible this time.
Sure,
this is the most important one for subtitles. Thanks a lot. Okay, we stop there. Now I'm going to speak for a moment or two before we go to the next sequence. I think the boy's name is Eller, and for me, he's so obviously introverted thinking. The idea that he has a complete blind spot where extroverted thinking is concerned. He does the homework, but he doesn't turn in the assignments because the teacher didn't ask for them. He doesn't get the simplest thing that everybody else gets. That the extroverted thinking drill is you do the homework and you turn in the assignment. So the mother doesn't know what to do with this. Then he is constantly developing theories about how things happen, which are just spun in his own mind. That the water, if you look at it a certain way, turns into wasps. That's where the wasps come from.
I think he said flick the water.
That's right. All of the above. I mean, this is... Plus, of course, using the pencil sharpener to sharpen the rocks. All the stigmata of introverted thinking is there. I've had to deal with that. It's my auxiliary function. It's sort of like your theory so completely and your idea so completely replaces life that you just strike out again and again and again. Your sensation is terrible. Your extroverted thinking is terrible. Your feeling is terrible. And you don't know when to stop. So this would be a hard child to raise. Very, very hard child to raise. And so, as you might expect, he raises himself. He brings himself up. He gets through it. His mother is extremely well-meaning, but she has very poor judgment, and she marries twice after to disastrous men that he has to put up with, one of whom is really quite sadistic, the other is just hapless. None of them like him, and he doesn't like them, and he will not accept law or instruction from anyone else. But he becomes his own man. His father is an extroverted feeling type who's never available with money or with support, who's just... it's really all up to the mother and his sister and he to somehow survive. And survive he does. Looking out the window turns out to be the best thing about him. He's en route to being a photographer. And he actually gets a scholarship to a state school that will enable him to live there and live away from home. So we see him in the last scene of the film, leaving mother, leaving home for the first day in college. And what happens then and there is when the miracle happens and he begins to construct what I would call a true philosophic attitude, rather than just the survival mode of just staying with his own dominant function and just refusing to grant space to anything else, which is pretty much where he was. So he's a man with strong defenses of the self who finally finds a place to open up. So let's take a look at how that happens at the last scene. Did you see the philosophy coming alive in the last? It sort of knits the whole film together. 12 years of experience, and it's all one moment. Kind of wonderful. It kind of holds, that idea holds his whole boyhood. So he has a way to think about what many would regard as a very unhappy childhood. Divorced parents, father that doesn't kick in, mother that's a little bit hapless, that can get only part of her life together and feels incomplete, and he can't be the completion for her. One way is to think about life as you're not getting anywhere. Another way to think about life is just one long unfolding moment. So the philosophy that emerges at the end is just as the aesthetic attitude was for Maisie, something that can really get Mason through. Mason, the name, the actor's name is Or, but Mason can get Mason through. So I'm sure you noticed in the background the explosion of energy perfectly contained by at the time of the sunset by the aesthetic couple forming or trying to form in the background over the sunset. But that would be obviously an extroverted, intuitive roommate. I'm not so sure that he and the woman with the brownies are going to be a very lasting couple, but one did have a feeling that Mason and the woman he met is really have something remarkable they're able to do between them. They do something very elegant here from a psychological point of view. I have a dream that someday there'll be an Academy Award for the best psychological design in a film. And I watch the way films are constructed from the standpoint of psychological design, and the way the dance teacher seems to me to represent introverted feeling, and the way he represents introverted thinking, but they cross-type as they're communicating with each other, because she's asking him how he feels, and he says something, to be honest, and then he says, I can't remember the word but right now, but effectively pretty wonderful. He's able to register finally an introverted feeling, and she comes up with the idea that life is just one moment. So the introverted feeling type comes up with introverted thinking, and the introverted thinking type comes up with introverted feeling. It's quite beautifully constructed, just beautifully constructed psychologically. And it suggests much more than just a temporary attraction between these two, but an actual bond being formed. And so it's a very charming moment, and a very adequate attitude, because, of course, the children of this particular generation face problems no one has ever faced before, or at least in recent times. My colleague Luigi Zoya, whose original, he lives in Milan, Italy, and he's written a number of books, and has also lived in America for a time. And one of his books is called Guilt and Growth, which is about economic development. And he has been charting the same issues that we chart in this country in terms of economic futures for people in Europe and in the West generally. And he says that this present generation of parents is the first generation of parents since the Renaissance that cannot looking at their children, say that the children are going to have a better economic future than they are. And that is hitting virtually every family where it hurts. It's very painful. Of course, many people worry about things like water supply, not just access to jobs, but access to things like water, all kinds of things. And so, if one is, in my upbringing, the idea was if you could finally get over your immaturity and knuckle down and do the things you're supposed to do and pass the courses and get out of school and do things, you will have a bright future. Everybody knows. It's just a question of how willing you are to work for it and get over your, whatever it is, your ambivalence about making a commitment to something that you can build on. And if you can just get over your immaturity, the future is fine. The problem is you getting over who you are right now. Whereas the theme song for Mason is I don't want to be a hero. And it's not about building toward a future, but actually making the most of the present. The accent is not on grow up and face the future. It's be here now and really be here. It's a very different idea. That Jung always had the idea that the child was the image of futurity, but the child in current films is much more an image of the present. And being present, and how to be present often with limited resources, making the most of little. That seems to me what Mason is able to do with just a little scholarship to a state school in the same state, and seems to make so much out of it, represents something about the present attitude and that philosophy of the moment that comes up. It's very, very interesting at the end of this film. Every generation is going to have to come up with cultural attitudes that work for it, and every person, if they're going to survive, has to find some cultural attitude eventually to, or else you don't develop a cultural attitude and you just sort of follow the fold, and that can happen too. But these days it seems that our cultures are not giving us very much to follow, and so we're really forced to find the cultural attitude in ourselves so that we're the ones that are holding ourselves in the uncertainty around us. So I think that more and more people who find themselves anxious enough to come to therapy are also eager to construct something different. And I've tried to give you a sense of what that construction looks like. So just reviewing one more time that we just saw introverted thinking, find introverted feeling, and bring that together to construct a philosophic attitude, an idea that feels right, and an idea that can actually work. It's an existential attitude, but it's not an existential attitude that's founded on despair or fear of death. It actually is an embrace of life, which is very nice. And the anima is very much part of it, which is lovely, just lovely. And the feminine can take more the lead. Unlike the mother who feels so alone, Patricia Arquette won an Academy Award for that performance and deserved it. It's a beautiful, small supporting role performance as the mother in that film. So that's the survey. So how do we normal, ordinary people who may or may not be as individual or as courageous or as resourceful or as imaginative as some of the people in these films, also just rub along and get by, as people always have, without going to special lengths to construct just one cultural attitude that they can adhere to so strongly with a sense of vocation that it enables them to survive, but can just somehow get through life not knowing everything and relying as much as anything on what doesn't go right and what the unconscious makes of that. I think there Joseph Henderson was very wise to add to his list of traditional cultural attitudes an attitude that he says has come alive in our own time. And that attitude is the psychological attitude. And we have enough time for me to illustrate it. I didn't know whether I would or not. But I'd like to leave you on a maybe amusing, comedic, and very happy note by talking a little bit about something that happened for one couple of people at the time of a wedding. So somewhere, yeah, I have this, and I'm going to have you go to a particular section of this. I want you to go to scene 19 of this, and I think we won't need the subtitles. I think people can hear it just to make it loud enough. Now, the film I'm going to show you is actually earlier than any of the other film clips I've shown you. It's from a film that was released in 1950 that I saw first run when I was 11 years old. And it became a classic American film. It's been remade subsequently with other people, but the original is one of the joyous films of all time, and that is Father of the Bride. It stars Spencer Tracy and Elizabeth Taylor. Now, when Elizabeth Taylor made this movie, she had never been married. She was actually, it was actually released at the time of her first marriage, just before her first marriage to Nicky Hilton. So she's a very lovely young woman in this, and Spencer Tracy makes the perfect father. So he's a lawyer father in a suburb of New York City, and he's paying for everything, and he's trying to take control of a situation that seems to be out of control. So we start at the wedding rehearsal. Then we have a dream that Father has that night, which is my favorite filmed dream sequence in all film. And it's by the great cinematographer John Alton, and the director is Vincent Minnelli, who's one of the great directors. It's a wonderful film sequence. And then we have Tracy waking up from the nightmare and having a conversation unexpectedly with his daughter in the kitchen. This is all the night before the actual wedding. Okay, let's have the lights on. The situation that Spencer Tracy was trying to master with the tools he'd learned as a lawyer and a successful professional man of his generation, was patriarchal marriage itself. And trying to save that one has turned out to be a fool's errand for lots of people. The ground, the checkered ground, is giving way. It's soft and rubber, and lots of people get lost in it. And so the daughter's fear of the wedding turns out to be right on. Our anxieties are always so well-founded. They usually are about something. And of course, when Elizabeth Taylor played this role, she didn't know that she would be married 8 times.
Maybe she did.
And it never quite worked. So she became a living symbol of something that we're still struggling with. The beauty of individuation is that you don't have to be on top of life. You do not have to be perfectly individuated. And the situation you're trying to control, which is also a situation that's spinning out of anyone's control because things are always changing in cultures. And what it means to be a father in one generation is not the same, as Eric Neumann says, with what it means to be a father in another generation. It spins in unknown directions. We cannot be in control. We do not have to be in control. And we don't always have to understand the chaos we're facing right now, except that we do have to understand that we are facing chaos. But you see, we dream, and the dream will show us, as Jung says, the actual situation in the unconscious. And perhaps the most interesting thing about this particular nightmare is that it isn't just a repeat of what the dreamer already knows, which is that he was at a very crazy wedding rehearsal and that this is not nearly as in control as the authority figures such as the minister are saying it is, who can't even recognize who the bride is, or the groom that doesn't show up, or the woman with the cold who's the stand-in for the bride, or or the rather hapless man who's supposed to be teaching them to do the wedding rehearsal, who doesn't really have the sensation to bring off the self-confidence he's evincing. It's also that the scream of terror that comes to him from his daughter at his inability, says the dream, to keep it together is actually empathy breaking through to this man. Because in a sense, this is not even his dream. He's having her anxiety as if it were his own. And there are many dreams like that, where we actually dream the feelings of the other that we have to integrate. We think all of our dreams are about us, and that's the height of narcissistic arrogance. So many of our dreams are preparing us for the situation of the other. How many times before a patient has first come to me for analysis have I had a dream 2 or 3 days before, or even the day of, in which I have, as if it were my problem, the problem the patient is going to present to me. And of course the dream is telling me that, among other things, I have to make it my problem. I have to make the other's problem my problem. So when the daughter says nothing ever phases you, he's able to be the strong father that she feels she needs at that moment and put on the persona, because something has already phased him and he has actually felt what she's feeling. And so he can afford to put on a persona because he's got the empathy. So if you think about that, it means that busily and inside ourselves, whether we know what's going on or not, and we know its impact not just on ourselves but on others, our dreams are taking up the issues of the other and instructing us about them. So we are being guided not in some conscious way by a list of psychological functions that have to be matched and integrated, and we all become chemists of typology, putting these things together and trying to cook them up for ourselves. No, it's not like that at all. It's that if we have a psychological attitude and we're capable of dreaming and we're capable of just letting our dreams happen to us, they're already preparing us for what we need to do and how we need to be able to embrace the feelings of the other. So one could say, of course, that this is an extroverted thinking man coming to grips with the anxieties of an extroverted feeling daughter. That's true on the surface, but more deeply, he's all of us. Spencer Tracy is all of us who are trying responsibly to cope, who are capable of letting the unconscious speak as well and opening us up to the whole range of problems that belong to the other. So we don't have to worry about whether we know how to do it. Our psyches are already on the case, and I think if we listen to them, just as we've always learned to do as Jungians, we already have all we need. So thank you. I want to thank you, Gus, for hanging in with my haplessness and my contagious inferior sensation. You were wonderful holding it all and making it happen. So thank you.
And thank you so much, Dr. Beebe, for the wonderful program. We are very grateful. So thank you.
You're very welcome.